Chapter 1932. I'm finally going to take this step, he murmured, as if he was trying to establish a sense of joy in his heart through this. Unfortunately, he couldn't find a trace of joy or satisfaction in his heart at this moment. All he felt was that it was a matter of course, and he wanted to go with the flow. After trying for a long time, he finally realized that it was impossible, so he immediately gave up on this idea. Since he couldn't find it, it was probably because he had long believed in this and felt that this was a natural change. There was nothing to be proud of or happy about at all. With this thought in mind, he opened up his mind and body and used his soul and body to accept the endless faith, as well as the law power that was born from the law worldview. The law power was born from the outside world, and it was also born from heaven and earth. The reason it came into being was that the worldview of laws had already become the main worldview of this world. In the end, the world's origin energy that should have been born in this world would naturally be transformed into the Dharma power of laws that was thinner and of lower quality. At this stage, it could be said that any living being would naturally recognize the law worldview. Their cultivation would no longer need to study the law worldview like before. Instead, they could be like other living beings in other worlds. They could absorb the heaven and earth spiritual energy from the outside world and absorb the energy from the outside world to strengthen their law power and finally embark on the path of cultivation. For Luo Fan, who was formed from the will of the world, this also meant that his efforts had achieved the greatest effect. As the main body of the law power and the main body of the nomological worldview, he naturally possessed the authority to control the countless law power. At this stage, it was equivalent to controlling all the origin energy in this world. Through this control, he would gradually obtain the supreme authority in this world, and in the end, he might even be able to replace this world. He would raise the level of his will to an infinite height. 1. The height of the will of the world at this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the origin source of the world, saw this scene and knew that the opportunity he had been waiting for over 100,000 years had finally arrived. However, when the change that he had been dreaming of appeared in front of him, he didn't feel as happy as he had imagined. Instead, he felt a little melancholic. There was a feeling of the fox mourning the death of the rabbit. In the end, I still came to this step. It's too difficult to become a true divine. He sighed to himself. What Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, wanted to pursue was to become a true saint and then truly break away from any part of the world and break away from the shackles of any chaotic state. All along, he had been working hard in this direction. He had been trying his best to reach this step. For the past 100,000 years, he had worked hard. It was all based on this. But finally at this moment, unknowingly, he had reached the point where he would once again become the will of the world. That's right. Currently, Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, was not forming the foundation of a true divine like he had imagined, nor was he becoming a true divine like he had imagined. Instead, it was slowly returning to its original form. That was the transformation of the will of the world that he had struggled to break free from. This kind of transformation, indeed, it was a rise in level. For itself, that was the case. It was indeed a kind of sublimation, a huge improvement. However, this kind of sublimation, this kind of improvement was what Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, wanted to avoid. If he encountered this in the beginning when he was still awake, the will of heaven and earth would definitely rather completely collapse and turn into countless fragments again. Then he would condense bit by bit and grow bit by bit, and he would never be willing to continue in this way. However, it was obvious that this situation did not occur. The current him had long been bound by the worldview of the laws that he had publicized. He had long become a part of the worldview of the laws, but it was no longer the worldview of the laws, but a part of him. In other words, the worldview of the laws had now become his master. It had become the worldview that could still exist even without him. In contrast, he had become the opposite. He had become an existence that would no longer exist if he did not have the worldview of the laws. Under such circumstances, his thoughts, his wishes, and even all his senses and ideas would naturally be born for the worldview of the laws. As long as it was beneficial to the worldview of the laws, he would definitely do it even if he had to abandon himself. This situation was similar to the life forms that were refined by the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light in the past. Or rather, it was the same nature, just that there were two different manifestations. The current change was because the worldview of the laws needed a will of heaven and earth to help it carry out in this world. It needed the will of heaven and earth to maintain this world under the rule of the worldview of the laws. In the end, he was the will of heaven and earth that was chosen, and it was precisely because the worldview of the laws had such an instinctive need that all the evolutions and sublimations of Luo Fan, who was formed by the will of heaven and earth, were unknowingly moving in this direction. I can't make this kind of mistake. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, he knew that he was no longer in any danger. With a thought, he slowly stepped out of the source of heaven and earth. After more than 100,000 years of development, Luo Fan's worldview of laws had become purer and more condensed than before. It was completely different from the world view nurtured by the will of the world. As soon as the world of laws that Luo Fan resided in appeared in this world, he naturally felt all kinds of powerful pressure that were born from the world. They wanted to crush his world of laws, devour it, and assimilate it. However, given Luo Fan's identity as the true owner of the worldview of laws, his control over the worldview of laws was not something that others could compare to. Although this kind of pressure that was born from the heavens and earth was terrifying, it was still not enough. In the end, he was still able to rely on the uniqueness and absoluteness of the world of laws to block it. In the end, he was able to make it shine even brighter. It was as if a huge sun had suddenly appeared in this place. To Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the world, the appearance of the real Luo Fan naturally couldn't escape his senses. At this moment, even though Luo Fan didn't have a body and only appeared in the form of the worldview, he had already cast his gaze over. Luo Fan didn't care about the gaze of the will of the world. At this moment, he just began to condense his worldview and rebuild his body bit by bit. This was because he knew very well that, to the current will of the world, he definitely wouldn't be in its eyes. Even if it saw him, it would only look at him with disdain. It definitely wouldn't attack or devour him like before. Sure enough, when Luo Fan, who was the manifestation of the will of the world, saw the real Luo Fan, a deep sense of disdain appeared in its eyes. To him, Luo Fan's current worldview was too inferior. It was so inferior that it couldn't even be seen. An existence with such a worldview had long since become an ant in his eyes. However, he no longer had the qualifications to be his opponent. In fact, he didn't even have the qualifications to be swallowed and replaced. Since that was the case, he naturally could not attack Luo Fan at the critical moment of his transformation. As a result, he quickly withdrew his gaze and looked up at the sky again, gradually experiencing the process of his body and mind continuously rising and transforming. Construct the body. For Luo Fan, it was not a difficult task. Not long after, he had already constructed his own body. As the body was constructed, the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light and the numinous treasure embryo that had fused with the concept were formed. He naturally recovered and reappeared in his body. He looked no different from before his body collapsed. At the same time, the entire world started buzzing. There was a hint of indescribable joy in that voice. Above this joy, there was an indescribable attractive force that came from the depths of the world. It came from a place even deeper than the origin of the world, and it directly acted on the world's will on the tallest building. Due to this suction force, the building completely collapsed in an instant. It turned into wisps of smoke and gradually disappeared without a trace. Then, the living beings that existed within naturally condensed in other locations outside the building. Everything seemed to be the same as before they collapsed. Only Luo Fan, who was formed by the world's will, remained where he was. However, he had been standing on the highest floor of the building earlier, but now he was floating in the air. He floated high in the sky and slowly spread his arms. It was as if he was embracing the entire world, but also as if he was waiting for something extremely sacred to descend. However, compared to the movements of his body, his eyes remained calm and indifferent, as if none of this was happening to him. It was extremely strange. This change was reflected in the eyes of all the living beings in the world. In an instant, indescribable worship appeared in the eyes of the countless living beings. Their faith in Luo Fan, who was formed by the world's will, became even firmer, and the prayers in their hearts became even more pious. Because of this change, the power of faith generated from the hearts of all living beings poured into Luo Fan's body, which was formed from the will of the world. It constantly pushed him to a higher height, causing him to gradually soar. His body also started to gradually expand and become bigger. In just a few short breaths, the worlds will formed Luo Fan no longer appeared in the hearts of the living beings through the indescribable connection. Instead, he directly swelled to a level that surpassed the imagination of all living beings. He became an existence that all living beings could see with their naked eyes. In the end, the suction force that came from the depths of the world's origin energy grew stronger and more terrifying. In the end, it surpassed a certain limit and shook slightly. With a slight tremble, the worlds will formed Luo Fan suddenly trembled, and his entire body collapsed. In the blink of an eye, he turned into smoke and scattered in all directions. Then, he was gradually devoured by the void and disappeared from the eyes of all living beings. More importantly, he disappeared from the hearts of all living beings. As he disappeared, the source of faith in all living beings suddenly disappeared, and all living beings abruptly woke up. What happened just now? Why am I kneeling here? This doubt surfaced in the hearts of almost all living beings, causing confusion to appear in their eyes. Their faces were filled with indescribable shock. I seem to have forgotten something extremely important. Just what is it? It seems to be about something. All sorts of headache-splitting doubts lingered in the hearts of all living beings, causing all living beings to feel an indescribable sense of irritation. At that moment, the entire world seemed to be on the verge of going berserk. There were hundreds of billions of living beings, and when so many living beings fell into irritation at the same time, what would the result be? It would definitely be war. At some point in time, a certain living being vented its irritation on other living beings, and it finally triggered a terrifying war that affected the entire world. This kind of war, all sorts of mysterious techniques, and all sorts of strange abilities blossomed everywhere. All kinds of mysterious techniques and all kinds of terrifying destructive powers were released all over the world. Rumble. At that moment, an indescribable rumble rang out in the sky. In the ears of all living beings, this rumble was just a rumble. At most, it contained an indescribable majesty, causing them to naturally feel an indescribable fear when they heard it. However, in Luo Fan's ears, this rumble, it was the words of the world's will. Moreover, it was words that he could completely understand. Becoming a true divine. It's really not fated with me. This was the content of that sentence. It's not that you're not fated. It's just that you've taken the wrong path. Luo Fan sighed at this moment and said, his words directly shook the worldview of laws, and through it, it produced some extremely subtle changes. After it was released, it became a sound that was completely undetectable to the ears of living beings. It spread far and wide, resonating with the new worldview of laws and the origin of heaven and earth, and transmitted to the depths of the origin of heaven and earth. You've indeed taken the wrong path. The world will once again transmitted its voice with a boundless rumble. Obviously, it had heard and understood Luo Fan's words. This situation was extremely mysterious, but it was only effective in this world. In other words, it would only be useful in this world from now on. Outside this world, or perhaps not in this time period, Luo Fan couldn't understand the voice made by the world's will at all, let alone transmit his voice to the worlds. Well, the reason for this was very simple. It was because his worldview was the worldview of laws. And the world's will had also grown to become the world's will in this world through the implementation of the worldview of laws, because it had achieved the world's will in this way. Even though its words contained endless mysteries that Luo Fan couldn't understand, it was ultimately still in line with the worldview of laws. And this was naturally what Luo Fan, who had created the worldview of laws by himself, wanted. He didn't need to understand it himself. His own worldview of laws would naturally be able to translate the words and become words that he could understand. Similarly, the words he said were the same. As long as it came into contact with the worldview and transmitted, it would naturally shake the worldview of the worldview. Then, it would naturally be transmitted to where the will of heaven and earth was located, becoming words that it could understand. This could be said to be a coincidence, but it could also be said to be an inevitability. However, whether it was a coincidence or an inevitability, it could only be effective in this world at this time. I really want to know what your current mentality is. Luo Fan suddenly said. He felt that at this moment, the world's will had become a completely different existence. It no longer had the hostility it had when it wanted to devour him and replace him, nor did it have the indifference and disdain it had when it was about to become the world's will. There was only a kind of calmness, as if it had seen through everything and seen through everything. My mentality? You won't understand even if I say it, said the world's will. Although it could communicate with Luo Fan through the resonance of the worldview of laws, the world's will was still the world's will. Its way of thinking was ultimately still completely different from that of living beings. Perhaps because of its previous experience as a living being, it could understand the way of thinking of living beings and understand everything in Luo Fan's words. But that was all. Its own way of thinking, its own state of mind, and its own way of thinking were still fundamentally different from that of a real living being. It was no longer something that a living being could understand. In fact, it was no longer something that could be expressed in a way that a living being could understand. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan had already obtained his own answer. Chapter 1933. You didn't come out to talk to me, just to sigh with emotion, did you? Luo Fan suddenly smiled faintly. This voice was transmitted to the origin of heaven and earth, where the will of heaven and earth was located, causing a series of rumbling sounds to be heard. Amidst the rumbling sounds, all the living beings in this part of the world felt an increasingly strong pressure on them. For a moment, everyone lowered their bodies even more. This was obviously the voice of the will of heaven and earth. However, this time, even Luo Fan couldn't hear what it was saying or what it was trying to express. What's going on? Luo Fan frowned. However, he soon figured it out. Perhaps the emotions of the will of heaven and earth itself had fluctuated greatly, causing the words it said to exceed the limits that his worldview of laws could bear. That was why the voice sounded like a rumbling sound in his ears. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan knew that he could only wait for the will of heaven and earth to react. After all, the gap in level was ultimately insurmountable, sure enough. After waiting for a while, the terrifying rumbling above the void began to gradually subside. In the end, it turned into some words in Luo Fan's ears. This world is being destroyed. I need your help. This world was born because of my great calamity, so it naturally can't exist for long. It's only natural that it's being destroyed. Luo Fan said. No, not this level of destruction. Not this level of destruction, but a more direct, more tragic destruction. The will of heaven and earth rejected Luo Fan's answer and said so. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, That's impossible. Although the direction of development of this world has been distorted, there's also a war brewing now, but overall, it's still developing in an orderly manner. There's definitely no danger of destruction. Boom, 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 boom. The same terrifying rumbling sound came from the sky again. However, this time, the rumbling sound wasn't as meaningless to Luo Fan as before. It didn't seem like a sound that could be completely translated through the worldview of laws. At this moment, the voice directly turned into endless information, surging into Luo Fan's mind. After his experience in this world, Luo Fan's ability to process information was many times stronger than before. If this boundless information was poured into his heart in the past, he would definitely feel bloated, and he might not be able to sort it out for a long time. However, with just a thought, an indescribable rune appeared in his heart, directly absorbing the countless pieces of information. Then, it flowed into his heart at a speed that he could endure, and he easily and completely understood it. After fully understanding the voice, Luo Fan's expression became extremely ugly. The tribulation, this time, was not limited to a single world. Instead, there were two different worlds. Apart from the world he was currently in, there was another world in the outside world that was even more powerful and terrifying. Moreover, at this moment, the other side of the world was slowly crashing towards this side of the world, seeing that they were about to make contact. Is there no end to it? I encountered such a collision outside the tribulation, and now I'm also going to encounter such a collision in this tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan only had such a thought in his mind. It was obvious that the result of the collision between the two worlds would be extremely tragic. Either this world would be completely destroyed, or the other world would be completely destroyed. If it was a little more serious, both worlds would be destroyed at the same time, and there was no fourth possibility. Even if he didn't know the purpose of this tribulation, Luo Fan clearly knew that if the world he was in was completely destroyed, what kind of impact would that have on him? Although he had already mastered the power of loss, and the amount was quite a lot. However, compared to his true realm, he was still far from it. In other words, his current strength was much weaker than his true strength. How was it possible for him to escape from this world? How could he still exist after the destruction of this part of the world? Therefore, it was obvious that the only thing he could do now was to help this side of the world survive the collision, or even completely devour the other side of the world. This way, he might not be able to survive this tribulation, but it was the only possibility for him to survive. With all these thoughts flashing through his mind, Luo Fan could only sigh in the end and say, "All right, what's your plan?" "I don't have a plan," the worlds will said directly. This answer made Luo Fan pause for a moment. However, thinking about it, the worlds was on a completely different level from his. It was obviously impossible for the world's will to generate inspiration under its will to survive. In fact, it was very likely that death was different from that of living beings. Under such circumstances, asking him to think of a solution was as ridiculous as asking a piece of wood to think of a way to save himself. Looks like I can only rely on myself. Luo Fan could only sigh again. Although I don't have a plan, I can help you, the world will said. As it spoke, a mysterious power of laws descended from the sky and quickly gathered in front of Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a bronze mirror. The bronze mirror was only the size of a palm, but it emitted the aura of the world, as if it contained countless worlds, and space-time. As the bronze mirror appeared, there was no longer any rumbling in the sky. Meanwhile, Luo Fan could no longer sense the existence of the world's will. He knew that this was definitely the last thing the world's will could do for him. With a sigh, he raised his hand and grabbed the bronze mirror. The moment he grabbed the bronze mirror, he felt like he was connected to it by blood. It felt like it was one of his organs or like it was his other arm or leg. With this feeling, he instantly understood all the effects and methods of using the copper mirror. The bronze mirror did not have any other effect other than allowing him to see the world's will's perspective. I can't believe it's giving me this perspective. At this moment, even Luo Fan could not help but show a look of joy on his face. Being able to see the world's will's perspective was a great opportunity for him. The most direct way was he could see the situation on the other side of the world through this perspective. This was also the main reason why the worlds will had given him this perspective. However, this was the use of this perspective to deal with the impending doom of the world. In fact, it would be a great opportunity for him if he placed this perspective on the other side of the world. First of all, If he placed this perspective on his world of laws, he would be able to gain a deeper understanding of his world through this perspective and perfect it through this understanding. Secondly, if he placed this perspective on his own power of laws, then he would have an extremely deep understanding of the endless uses of the power of laws and all the mysteries contained within it. He would definitely be able to increase his strength by hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times in an extremely short period of time. Apart from these two, there were many other uses for it. Every single one of them was enough to allow him to improve tremendously. If this wasn't a great opportunity, he couldn't imagine what could be called a great opportunity. With a thought, he turned the bronze mirror. It shone on himself. In the blink of an eye, all the details of his body were projected into his heart through the bronze mirror. Next, he controlled the bronze mirror and let it go deeper and deeper. In the end, it went past the level of his physical body, the level of space-time, and directly went deep into the level of the origin of life. All the mysteries of the origin of life that had transformed into the world of laws appeared in his heart without reservation. This origin of life was reconstructed with his own will. He had already understood all of the profundities within. It seemed like there was nothing else that needed further study. However, when he used the perspective of the world's will to observe himself, he discovered the mysteries that he had originally completely understood in his heart were now shrouded in new shadows. These shadows were hidden in the depths of the world of laws. They were hidden in the bits and pieces that Luo Fan's world of laws had yet to touch upon. Moreover, through this feeling, he had a feeling that the mysteries contained in the depths of the world of laws were much more than what Luo Fan was currently displaying. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan almost completely forgot about the great calamity that was about to befall this world. His mind was almost uncontrollably immersed in it. He began to experience, study, and work hard to illuminate the shadows and enrich the world of laws. However, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan after all. Although he was immersed in it for a while, it did not take long for him to return to his senses. He used his strong will to break away from the state of deep study. If the world is destroyed, then no matter how much I study, it won't help at all. He kept repeating this sentence in his heart. He strengthened his will and forced himself to turn the copper mirror in another direction. He turned the copper mirror towards the sky, towards the outside world. As the copper mirror turned, the mysteries of his body and the world of laws were completely removed from his heart. There was no longer any trace of them left. They were replaced by the various things of the world. Observing the world from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth was like closing his eyes to observe the inside of his body. It was a kind of absolute control, complete control. It was as if everything that happened in the world was happening inside his body, and after countless overlaps and derivations, it would form the most profound influence on him. This was another kind of feeling of being connected by blood. In a trance, he felt as if he had become the world itself. Every breath he took would cause this world to change drastically, and it would become the fundamental change of this world. This feeling was equally addictive. However, compared to the world of laws that was directly observing and comprehending the world of laws from the perspective of the world's will, it was still a little lacking. Luo Fan was able to break free from his previous state, so there was no problem at this time. With a thought, he expanded his vision once more. This time, he looked beyond the world and saw another world that was crashing toward this world. The moment he saw the other world, he felt like he was looking at a mirror that transcended time and space. The world on the other side felt like. It was the feeling he had when he was in this world more than 100,000 years ago. What's going on? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He was confused. A question gradually arose in his heart. With a thought, the copper mirror gradually began to emit a strange, invisible light. This kind of light faintly showed a kind of gray color like chaos. Following the changes in the copper mirror, Luo Fan felt that his field of view began to rapidly strengthen. The situation of the world that was fiercely crashing towards him began to appear more and more clearly in his mind. Very soon, His vision pierced through the barrier, and he saw the scene in that corner of the world. When he saw everything clearly, his expression changed even more, because a building that he was very familiar with immediately appeared in front of him. That building was almost indomitable. Its appearance, image, and even aura were all the same as the building that Luo Fan had built back then. At this moment, two pairs of eyes suddenly rushed out from the building, brazenly colliding with his line of sight. A silent thunderclap suddenly sounded in Luo Fan's heart. The copper mirror in his hand suddenly trembled, and cracks even flashed across the surface of the copper mirror. "This is me." In an instant, Luo Fan's heart gave birth to an almost unbelievable feeling. The two lines of sight that collided with the perspective of the worlds had almost collapsed the copper mirror. It felt like it was coming from him. However, how could this happen? Luo Fan was both shocked and puzzled in his heart. However, when he thought about the situation inside that world and the indomitable building, he suddenly felt that it would only make sense if there was another him on the other side. "Who's spying on us?" A cold shout suddenly sounded in that world. Although the voice did not have the ability to penetrate the gap between the two worlds and enter this world, Luo Fan, who heard the voice through the perspective of the world's will, was still shocked. It was not only because the voice sounded almost exactly the same as the voice he spoke. It was also because the voice contained. The feeling of the world's view of laws was even stronger than what he said. There was obviously only one possibility. That was, the other him in the other world had a more complete world's view of laws than him. Moreover, this world's view of laws was definitely not the kind of world's view that was publicized for everyone to help him perfect. It was the real world's view that he had sorted out and perfected bit by bit. For a moment, the expression on Luo Fan's face became extremely solemn. "Who exactly are you?" Luo Fan asked. The voice was directly transmitted to the other world through the copper mirror. Most cultivators who had yet to become immortals were able to synchronize their five senses. For someone at Luo Fan's level, there was no problem at all. For the world's will, it was an extremely basic characteristic. Therefore, although he was only using the perspective to observe the other world, as long as he was willing, sounds, smells, and even touch could be directly transmitted through the perspective. At this moment, a tremendous rumble suddenly rang out from the other side of the world. It resounded through the entire world, causing all living beings in the world to feel a powerful dignity that directly affected their hearts. They almost could not help but prostrate themselves in worship. So the other me has already reached this step. At this moment, a figure leaped out of the tallest building and appeared at the top of the building, looking up. The pair of eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of the world and directly see Luo Fan in the other world. However, Luo Fan knew that this was just an illusion. At this moment, the other party wasn't looking at him, but the line of sight that he was transmitting through the copper mirror. However, due to the reverse effect of the line of sight, he felt like he was being directly seen by the other party. "It seems like you know your own nature, and you also know me," Luo Fan said at this moment. The voice also turned into a rumbling roar in the other world, but the other Luo Fan could also hear it clearly through the worldview of the rules. "Of course, I was born from the tribulations, and everything about my existence is completely based on you." The other Luo Fan smiled at this moment. Judging from his expression, there was no resentment or dissatisfaction. There was only an inexplicable sense of gratitude. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed. If the other party was only resentful, it would be fine. Although it would be a little troublesome to deal with him, he still had an advantage, so it wouldn't be too difficult to win. But now, it was clear that he had completely recognized himself and his opponent, so the difficulty of dealing with him had increased by 10 times or even 100 times. "I've been thinking about what kind of development you'll take and what kind of path you'll take." The other Luo Fan sighed. His expression was one of nostalgia and naive curiosity. "I think you should have seen it by now. How do you feel?" Luo Fan sighed. "I feel a little surprised and a little disappointed." The other Luo Fan smiled. "Why are you surprised? Why are you disappointed?" Luo Fan was curious. I'm surprised because you're strong enough now, and I'm disappointed because the path you take is different from mine. The other Luo fan didn't hide anything and answered without any hesitation. Chapter 1934. In that case, your objective is the same as the will of the world earlier, to defeat me and replace me. Luo fan sighed and said, the best novel reading experience is here. This was actually very easy to guess. The other Luo fan's situation was very similar to his. Even his mentality was the same. Under such circumstances, if he were to put himself in her shoes, he would naturally be able to guess her thoughts. If he was in his opponent's position, it was obvious that he would be thinking of defeating his opponent and completely replacing his opponent. After all, only in this way would he have a trace of a chance to escape this tribulation and still exist after the tribulation vanished. Otherwise, if he couldn't do this, he wouldn't even need his opponent to do anything. He could just wait for the tribulation to pass. Regardless of whether his opponent overcame the tribulation or failed, it would still be his doomsday. Isn't it obvious? The other Luo fan said. It's indeed very obvious. I spoke too much nonsense. Luo fan just sighed. Since it had come to this, there was nothing more to say. With a thought, the perspective transmitted to the other side of the world through the copper mirror gave rise to countless mysterious and complicated changes. Amidst the endless changes, a figure gradually condensed in that part of the world. This figure was none other than Luo fan. In other words, this figure was Luo fan's doppelganger, or rather, projection. Because it was a projection condensed from the perspective of the world's will, its strength was vaguely stronger than Luo fan's real body. The moment it appeared in the world, it caused the world to tremble slightly, and the laws there became indescribably chaotic. As expected, the laws of this world. It's exactly the same as the world that hasn't changed in the past. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo fan's mind. After all, he was a living being. Although he could obtain more information from the perspective of the world's will, he was still a living being. He could observe more, but there were still too many things that he needed to go through complex transformations to understand. In comparison, the doppelganger that he had condensed at this time was much easier to deal with. Even though it seemed like only a slight change in his receiving form. This change in receiving form had already transformed the various information he received into a state that was completely suitable for him as a living being. Hence, what he sensed at this moment was much more direct than what he had sensed with the help of the world's will. It was even more mysterious. Right at this time, a streak of spiritual light soared into the sky from below. In a flash, it had already transcended time and came crushing down on him. Facing such an attack, Luo fan instinctively raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The power of countless space-time dimensions suddenly condensed and wrapped around the spiritual light. The power of the space-time dimension was extremely terrifying in this kind of low space-time dimension. Under the suppression of this power, the spirit light was completely suppressed. He didn't even have the ability to resist before he completely collapsed. The power of space-time dimensions? I have that too. The other Luo fan's words entered Luo fan's ears in an instant. Immediately after, the surrounding light and shadow changed. The space-time dimension instantly became extremely chaotic. The rules and laws also became extremely chaotic at this moment. It was difficult to distinguish what form it originally had. In the eyes of all living beings, the figure that had suddenly appeared in the sky was suddenly enveloped by a mass of gray clouds. Then, the cloud trembled, and everything disappeared completely. Everything was gone. Regardless of whether it was the cloud or the figure wrapped in the cloud, they were all the same. Whether it was the cloud or the figure wrapped by the cloud, they couldn't see it. They couldn't see that in the higher space-time dimension, the strongest powerhouse in this world had already erupted in a shocking battle with another equally powerful powerhouse. This world was mysterious and mysterious, wonderful and wonderful. The space-time dimension structure here was completely different from the Earth's universe. Here, although there was a difference in the space-time dimension, that difference was not the same as the Earth's universe. In this world, although there was a difference in space-time dimensions, that difference did not exist in the form of the Earth's universe. In this world, the higher space-time dimension was above the lower space-time dimension. However, the higher space-time dimension only existed in a strange way of space-time dimension construction. There were no living beings in it, and it didn't even produce a flourishing, strange world that was comparable to the higher space-time dimension of the Earth's universe. The place was completely a boundless sea of space-time dimensions. It was like the state of chaos. It seemed extremely chaotic, but also extremely mysterious. And in this sea, the lower space-time dimension was like a drop of seawater that was relatively special in this sea. The reason why it was special was because under the higher space-time dimension, only this current space-time dimension had complete order and the existence of real living beings. It was as if the essence of all the other space-time dimensions had been attracted to this current space-time dimension and turned into resources for the perfection of this space-time dimension. It was more like an invisible restriction existed in this world, causing the order of this world to only exist in this lower space-time dimension. No matter which Luo fan it was, none of them paid attention to the current situation. It was not only because their enemies were each other, but also because they actually didn't think that this situation was anything to be surprised about. Because this world was constructed from the power of tribulations. Moreover, the foundation of this world was the fragment of the larger world. Either one of these two reasons was enough to determine that this world couldn't have other endless lower space-time dimensions or the higher space-time dimensions of order. Naturally, there was nothing more to say about the world constructed by tribulations. Even if it was a great tribulation, it couldn't really construct a truly perfect world to test Luo Fan. He was merely an ordinary living being who was pursuing sainthood. Even if he had gone quite far on this path, in the eyes of the world and in the state of chaos, what difference was there between him and an ordinary living being? How could the state of chaos specially descend on a perfect world to test him? Since it wasn't even a perfect world, how could a perfect world with endless space-time dimensions appear? As for the second reason, the foundation of this world was the fragment of the larger world. This was even simpler. The larger world itself was an existence without tribulations and immeasurable. Although he still couldn't fully understand such an existence, he vaguely understood it. Such a world probably didn't have any difference in space-time dimensions. This was just a guess. However, regardless of which Luo Fan was, they were extremely confident in their own guesses. Therefore, they naturally agreed that it was unlikely for the countless space-time dimensions to appear in this world at this moment. The two of them were in the sea of space-time dimensions, and the surrounding space-time dimensions were under their control. They constantly twisted and changed, forming all kinds of mysterious forms that would even make ordinary living beings' bodies and minds completely explode. They launched countless terrifying attacks at each other. Such attacks were extremely powerful. If this world had endless space-time dimensions like the Earth's universe, then each attack would probably be enough to destroy billions of space-time dimensions. It would be enough to completely destroy billions of living beings in billions of space-time dimensions. Even in this world, even in this place, this kind of attack was already incomparably shocking. Every single attack caused the dimensional ocean to churn, causing countless waves to form in the area. In their bodies, the law power surged. Every bit of law power manipulated the space-time dimensional changes, enough to destroy any lower space-time dimension. The efficiency was enough to make all those who claimed to have talent in the use of power feel ashamed to death. The two of them were a little different. Luo Fan's law power was much less than the other Luo Fans, and there was also a faint difference in quality. However, compared to his opponent, he had another advantage. That was, he had already seen all the mistakes made by the will of heaven and earth. As for the hidden dangers and weaknesses that originally existed in the world of laws, he had an extremely clear understanding of them. Now, with the help of the projection condensed from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth, the law power's manipulation of space-time dimensions was more efficient and more stable. As long as the other Luo fan had a slight oversight in the operation of space-time dimensions, he would definitely be able to seize it and easily disintegrate his attack. In contrast, although the other Luo fan's worldview was influenced by the development of the world in that world, he grew faster and became purer due to the conflict between them. However, in the end, he didn't recognize the various omissions and hadn't seen the real negative examples with his own eyes. In the end, there were still many omissions revealed in the battle. Of course, strictly speaking, those couldn't really be considered as omissions. They could only be considered as imperfections. However, such an existence had already given Luo Fan a chance, allowing him to seize the weakness, erupt, and instantly defeat it, completely disintegrating all the attacks. It was precisely because of this that the battle between the two sides fell into a stalemate. Whether it was Luo Fan or the other Luo Fan, neither of them could truly suppress their opponents, and neither could they achieve a real victory. The impact of this stalemate was that the scale of the battle between the two sides continued to increase and expand. In the end, the fluctuations in the space-time dimensional ocean became more and more intense and terrifying. In the end, it gradually affected the normal space-time, which was the most special point of seawater in the space-time dimensional ocean. So this is your goal. Suddenly, the other Luo fan said. As he said this, he suddenly retracted his hand, and in a flash, he was already far away from Luo Fan with a faint smile on his face. When Luo Fan saw this, he knew that his plan had been seen through by the other party. He couldn't help but sigh. What a pity! If only I had a little more time, I would have achieved my goal. It's a pity that I still discovered it a little too late. The other Luo Fan turned his head to look at the extremely special point in the middle of the battle between the two of them, and couldn't help but look a little helpless. That extremely special point was naturally the normal space-time, which was the only low-level space-time dimension that existed in order. But now that low-level space-time dimension was already trembling violently. Countless fluctuations rolled over and attacked it with great force, causing it to gradually lose its original position and its original stability. With one look, the two Luo fans' eyesight easily penetrated the barrier of the space-time dimension and saw the scene inside. At this moment, the space-time dimension had already fallen into chaos. There were countless thunderbolts in the sky, and cracks would appear in the sky from time to time. The stars in the sky seemed to have been casually rubbed by someone, and had already lost their original shape. They would gather into a ball at times, and then randomly scatter at other times. The scene was so chaotic that it was unimaginable, and it was impossible to connect it with the real sky. Needless to say, there was no need to talk about the ground. There were also countless cracks appearing, and it was also chaotic everywhere. However, compared to the various changes in the sky, which were only shocking, the chaos on the ground was already fatal. Every time there was chaos, even the smallest chaos, it could be said to be a disaster for all living beings. Countless living beings perished in the chaos, and wails of anguished wails could be heard. A series of roars rang out from the heaven and earth. Perhaps in the other world, the world had made a fundamental mistake, causing its own existence to degenerate back into the world will. Needless to say, his actions had created an extremely wonderful outcome. That world had developed into a true world of cultivation. There were powerful cultivators there. They were everywhere. That creature's ability to resist world disasters was 100 times stronger than before. In comparison, this world was the complete opposite. However, to the other Luo Fan was not a match for him. The development of this world was extremely suitable for him, extremely suitable for his cultivation, allowing him to obtain great benefits in the process of development. However, for the development of civilization in this world, his choice did not help much at all. In this corner of the world, they were still in the same state of technological civilization as before. Among them, there were very few living beings with extraordinary powers, and it was not even enough to form a complete cultivation civilization. Under such circumstances, the resistance of that world against disasters did not even need to be a world disaster. Just a small disaster with a slightly wider scope was enough to cause a disaster for all living beings in that world. Therefore, the current scene in this part of the world was really tragic to the point of being indescribable. Not to mention anything else. Just when the two Luo fans were confronting each other, nearly 10% of the living beings in this world had already been annihilated. It should be noted that the number of living beings in this world was at least calculated in the trillions. Nearly 10% of such a large number of living beings had been destroyed. This number was enough to make anyone with a heart of stone feel despair. The other Luo fan looked at Luo fan and said, "This is not enough to completely resolve the danger of the collision between the two worlds." He was also Luo fan, and his mind was naturally extremely firm. Although the world that he had cultivated for so many years had suddenly become so tragic, and so many living beings had died, it was not enough to leave any trace in his heart. He acted as if nothing had happened. He was still calm and indifferent. Indeed, it is not enough to completely resolve the problem. However, as long as the same change happens again, it should be enough to resolve the problem, Luo fan said at this moment. After all, both sides had stopped fighting, and the tremors that caused the fluctuations of the low space-time dimension had gradually subsided. Therefore, the doomsday change in the world had also gradually subsided. It could be predicted that if this continued, all the disasters would stop soon. Luo fan did not directly attack the low space-time dimension. Apart from knowing that the other Luo fan would stop him, it was also because such a direct attack would not have too much impact on the low space-time dimension. After all, the low space-time dimension was not an ordinary low space-time dimension, but a kind of space-time dimension that was born from absorbing the essence of almost all the other space-time dimensions in this world. Such a low space-time dimension was strong and stable, and it went without saying. Luo fan could easily destroy the attacks of other low space-time dimensions. But when facing this low space-time dimension, the biggest possibility was not the destruction of the low space-time dimension, but that he could not withstand the counterforce of the attack and directly collapsed and died. As for why the aftermath of the previous battle could cause chaos in the low space-time dimension, the reason was even simpler. Because at that time, what really caused the low space-time dimension to change was not the power of both sides, but the power of the other space-time dimensions. Because there were many other low space-time dimensions as a buffer, the counterforce of the low space-time dimension was not directly transmitted to the two Luo fan, but was completely digested by the entire space-time dimension ocean. Indeed. But now I already know. The other Luo fan only smiled faintly at this moment. His words were filled with irrefutable confidence, and he firmly believed that as long as he was able to do so, knowing this, Luo fan would never be able to achieve his goal. He would never be able to cause the same level of chaos again. Chapter 1935. As he spoke, the law power on his body began to surge. In the blink of an eye, it had already rushed out of his body and stirred the endless space-time dimension around him, causing more and more obvious and intense ripples to appear in the space-time dimension. Although these ripples were not as intense and shocking as the ripples that were created during their battle, they were still extremely terrifying. They were also becoming more and more intense. Unknowingly, they had started to head towards that special space-time dimension. They wanted to see the space-time dimension being shaken, just like what they had done during their battle earlier. Although this method was much weaker compared to the previous battle, if a large number of them were stacked together, the impact would still reach that level. Seeing this, the other Luo fan's expression couldn't help but change slightly. In this situation, it was obviously the most correct way to destroy that space-time dimension. If Luo fan could think of it, he could naturally think of it too. In an instant, he also made his move. The law power within his body began to rapidly release from his body, and it also began to shake this part of the world. It shook all the space-time dimensions in the space-time dimensional ocean, causing ripples to appear, and they continued to move towards the ripples that Luo fan had created. There were peaks and troughs in the vibrations. superimposing the peaks and troughs in a vibration that were completely opposite to each other could cancel out the vibrations. This was also the principle used by ordinary mobile phones to reduce the noise, and this was also the principle used by the other Luo fan at this moment. The vibrations caused by Luo fan were offset by the vibrations exerted by the other Luo fan. Instead, the surrounding ripples that were gradually triggering the vibrations of the special space-time dimension slightly calmed down. Seeing this, Luo fan just smiled faintly. At this moment, the law power in his body began to surge. The vibrations around him that were born because of his law power suddenly changed at this moment. They were no longer as calm as before, but rapidly changed. They changed hundreds of millions of times in almost an instant. For the other Luo fan, every change was like a dream to him. They were all a challenge, because while he analyzed Luo fan's changes, he had to exert an opposite vibration to counteract them. Only then could he ensure that the world wouldn't be shaken and destroyed. Compared to Luo fan, this was obviously more complicated and difficult. For a time, Luo fan gradually gained the upper hand. Those were the ripples caused by the law power. Although it was constantly being offset, it was still increasing at a rather slow rate, and the area of effect was also growing larger and larger. Although it hadn't affected the special space-time dimension yet, it was obviously only a matter of time. The other Luo fan had an inexplicable expression on his face, but he wasn't anxious. He was just unhurriedly resisting Luo fan's attack using this method that seemed to have no effect. Naturally, Luo fan was happy to see this happen. His law power of law continued to surge from his body without the slightest of stopping. He constantly exerted all the vibrations he knew, constantly causing the surrounding space-time dimension to vibrate in Luo fan's own senses. Time gradually passed, and before he knew it, tens of thousands of years had passed. Of course, this was just his senses. In fact, in the space-time dimensional ocean, time had no meaning at all. In fact, if they returned to the lower space-time dimension at this time, only a moment might have passed, or billions of years might have passed. You don't think. We can get through this tribulation this way, right? At this time, the other Luo fan spoke. Luo fan frowned. Could it be that he still has other means? However, if he were to put himself in his shoes, there might really be other ways at this moment. The figure of the other Luo fan began to gradually change. This change was extremely subtle and mysterious. Under this change, the surroundings seemed to undergo some sort of inexplicable change. Luo fan was a little confused at first, but he soon understood what was going on and couldn't help but be secretly shocked. This was clearly a sign of synchronizing his own time with the time of the outside world. If this was in a lower space-time dimension, it naturally wouldn't have much effect. After all, the space-time structure of a low space-time dimension determined the stability of time and space. Even if it was another existence at Luo fan's level, facing such a stable space-time structure, it would be completely impossible for him to completely solve it. However, in this higher space-time dimension, the situation was completely different. In the higher space-time dimension, time, space, and even space-time were existences with the same nature as any other energy. It was possible to change such an existence as long as it could affect the space-time dimension. Therefore, in this higher space-time dimension, the impact caused by the other Luo fan's means was self-evident. At this moment, Luo fan felt that his own time seemed to be drawn out bit by bit. The tens of thousands of years of time that he had experienced before had unknowingly begun to be gradually reflected in that lower space-time dimension, reflected in the world where his main body was located. As a result, the collision between the two worlds started to accelerate and stack on top of each other. In this acceleration, the speed at which the two worlds approached each other began to increase rapidly. This is using the passage of time to promote the collision between the two worlds. This thought flashed through Luo fan's mind, and his expression instantly became extremely ugly. He had to stop this situation. If he allowed this to continue, his action of stopping the other Luo fan here would become a complete joke. With this thought in mind, The magic power of the laws in Luo Fan's body changed its original constant oscillation and transformed into a mysterious method to produce an effect. It also began to assimilate his own time with the outside world. However, through the manipulation of his own time, he had compressed the tens of thousands of years of time just now into an instant. Therefore, this kind of assimilation, it was completely different from the other Luo Fan. It was trying its best to slow down the passage of time in the outside world. Under this kind of change, the time in that special lower space-time dimension began to gradually slow down. The other Luo Fan was also Luo Fan. At this time, facing Luo Fan's action, he just smiled faintly and instantly changed his way of assimilating time. Sometimes it was distorted, sometimes it was soaring rapidly, and sometimes it was slowly accelerating. Sometimes it was speeding up, and sometimes it was stopping, and so on. It was just like the powerful vibrations that Luo Fan had displayed before, again and again. This situation was simply like a replica of the previous one. It was just that the active and passive parties had already been flipped over. The time in that special lower space-time dimension was sometimes fast and sometimes slow. It was even distorted and sometimes spiraled. This was nothing for the creatures in that lower space-time dimension. For them, everything was completely normal because they were also within the realm of distortion. However, in the eyes of Luo Fan, who was observing everything from the perspective of the world's will, all of this was so obvious that it caused his mood to constantly change along with it. After all, the active party still had a big advantage over the passive party. Therefore, at this time, even if Luo Fan tried his best to resist and eliminate the other Luo Fan's assimilation of time, he couldn't change the fact that time was speeding up and the two worlds were quickly colliding. It seems that if this goes on, the result will not be changed. After all, the result cannot be changed. Luo Fan secretly sighed at this time. With this sigh, he instantly withdrew the assimilation of time in the outside world. With this sigh, he instantly withdrew his assimilation of time to the outside world. Instead, he concentrated all of his energy on himself. He concentrated on the trait that he possessed, which equated 1 trillion years with an instant. As he concentrated on this, the influence of the accelerated passage of time on him began to gradually disappear. It didn't take long before there was no longer any influence. Although the passage of time was already speeding up rapidly, he was already one with the light. He was also observing and sensing everything at the same speed, as if he was under the normal flow of time. At this time, the one whose expression changed was no longer Luo Fan, but the other Luo Fan. You've actually developed this ability to this step. The other Luo Fan said with a somewhat helpless and somewhat admiring expression. For the other Luo Fan, the ability to equate hundreds of millions of years with an instant was also a special ability that he possessed. It was just that this special ability only remained in his own senses, and he couldn't manifest it externally. Moreover, he couldn't really affect the essence of time in his body and equate it with the outside world. In contrast, Luo Fan, who could do this, had clearly far surpassed him in this aspect. It seems that there's no way to determine the outcome of a battle with you at this level. Luo Fan didn't respond to that sentence, and he just said this. He didn't feel too happy about being able to deal with the other party's influence on the passage of time. Although this was a trait that he had developed by relying on his pure worldview, there were too many abilities that he couldn't use at this time because of this choice. For example, what he was doing just now, which was to continuously shake the ocean of space-time dimensions in order to shatter the lower space-time dimensions, was no longer possible. After all, at this time, he was entrusting his own time to the other Luo Fan's change of time. Under such circumstances, in this high space-time dimension, any of his attacks would be within the grasp of the other Luo Fan. It would be extremely difficult for him to injure the other Luo Fan, to the extent that it was almost impossible. Under such circumstances, how would Luo Fan choose? Was there a need to say anything else? After losing this effective method, it was obviously impossible to directly deal with the other Luo Fan in front of him. Don't you think that the outcome of the battle has already been decided? The other Luo fan said with a smile on his face. Indeed, strictly speaking, what the other Luo fan said was correct. After all, Luo fan was here now, and there was no way for him to deal with him. And he still had countless means to deal with Luo fan. Luo fan just smiled faintly and said, "This is just my clone. Have you forgotten?" As he spoke, Luo fan's body in the space-time dimensional ocean began to gradually dissipate, and after a while, it completely turned invisible and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the other Luo fan's expression stiffened, and he sighed. His heart trembled slightly, but he could only gradually disappear in the space-time dimensional ocean. As he disappeared in the space-time dimensional ocean, in that special lower space-time dimension, his figure began to gradually appear from nothing. At this moment, Luo fan felt that the mysterious mechanism that affected his time suddenly lost its effect, and all his senses had completely returned to normal in an instant. Faced with such a situation, he naturally understood what had happened in an instant. He only showed a faint smile on his face. As for the other Luo fan's choice, he seemed to feel that it was only natural. After all, in order to maintain this mechanism that continuously exerted influence on him, the other Luo fan could only stay in that higher space-time dimension. In other words, within the space-time dimensional ocean. And if he stayed there, then in this normal world, obviously, he would no longer exist. In other words, this part of the world would be out of his control during the collision between the heavens and the earth, and he would not be able to control how it would develop in the end. In this way, this part of the world would completely fail in the collision, and the possibility of it being completely destroyed was self-evident. That was the other Luo fan. How could he sit back and watch this happen? Therefore, his choice. It was only natural. For Luo fan, defeating the other Luo fan in this level of low space-time dimension was not an easy task. It was extremely difficult. Moreover, if things did not go smoothly, the other Luo fan could directly hide in that higher space-time dimension and enter the space-time dimensional ocean. In that case, even if Luo fan had an absolute advantage in strength, it would be difficult for him to do anything to him. Moreover, he did not have that kind of absolute strength yet. He sighed in his heart, and with a thought, this clone formed from the perspective of the worlds had already completely collapsed with a slight tremble, turning completely illusory. It once again transformed into the perspective of the world's will and disappeared without a trace. Do you want to leave victory and defeat in this world? At the same time, the other Luo fan appeared at the place where he had disappeared. He looked up at the sky, and his eyes seemed to penetrate the sky, penetrate the chaos, and see another world. Then come. In the end, he spat out such a sentence. These words were resolute and filled with boundless determination. At this moment, Luo fan's original body, which was holding the copper mirror in that world, had a look of sorrow on its face. In the face of his other self, it was impossible to take a shortcut. With a thought, he began to change the direction of the perspective of the world's will from the other world to this world itself. Currently, there were still tens of thousands of years before the collision between the two worlds. This period of time was neither long nor short, so it was naturally impossible for him to completely change the appearance of this world from the beginning to become something completely different. There was no need to even think about it. However, if he wanted to use another method to integrate this world so that the power of this world could be better condensed and so that this world could perform better in the collision between the worlds, it was still possible. This was especially so when Luo fan now possessed the perspective of the world's will. At the level of the world's will, even the perspective already possessed supreme power and contained endless power. With such a perspective, Luo fan could mobilize all the power in this world, which originally required him to use many methods to mobilize with a single thought and unleash all kinds of power that originally required all kinds of schemes. In this way, he would be able to change this part of the world at a depth that was several times stronger than what he could do alone. He would be able to make the power of this part of the world gather in a way that far exceeded 100%, and finally form a crushing force against another part of the world. As his perspective changed, the situation of this world was gradually reflected in his heart. Observing this world from the perspective of the worlds felt like he was controlling his own body, and all kinds of indescribable comprehension surfaced in his heart. As he comprehended these various things, the various imperfections of the world's operation appeared in his heart bit by bit. If he were to observe these imperfections from other perspectives, even if he were to observe them from his own perspective, he would only be able to vaguely sense them and would definitely not be so clear. This was just like how only one could truly understand oneself. You are the only one who can truly understand your true weakness. No matter how much others could see through one, they could only see a part of it, and it was impossible for them to see through all of one's weaknesses. For Luo Fan, who possessed such a perspective, improving this world was equivalent to improving his own body. In other words, it was equivalent to another form of body refining. Chapter 1936. In an instant, all kinds of mysterious body structures appeared in his mind. He wanted to read books. After cultivating for such a long time, Luo Fan had already developed an instinct for cultivation. As these thoughts appeared, he naturally manipulated this world to produce all kinds of subtle changes. For a time, the wind and clouds surged. Endless thunder and lightning crackled in the sky. All the living beings in this world vaguely felt that an indescribable change had appeared in the surrounding world. This change was naturally both joyous and worrisome for the cultivators who cultivated the power of laws. They were joyous because the process of this world changing was faintly revealing a profound mystery that was greatly beneficial to the growth of the power of laws. However, they were worried because this change was pushing this world to a state that they didn't want to see or even imagine. This was simply abolishing their cultivation. So how could they not be worried? After an unknown period of time, the entire world suddenly trembled violently. Amidst the tremors, specks of strange light appeared in this world. Like snowflakes, they gradually fell from the sky. At the same time, the laws of the entire world began to change faintly. Originally, this world had already regarded the worldview of laws as the only worldview in this world, and the living beings in this world had already regarded the worldview of laws as the foundation of their own cultivation. However, at this moment, after this change went a step deeper, and the status of one's worldview became even more important. However, this change was not all good for all the cultivators who cultivated the power of laws in this world. But it wasn't all a good thing. This was because as this process deepened, the concept of the worldview of laws also began to slowly change. The original worldview of laws was named after laws. The foundation was also developed from Luo Fan's worldview of laws. However, because of the influence and changes of the living beings over the past 100,000 years, the current worldview of laws had undergone earth-shattering changes compared to the past. The powerful universality made the worldview of laws the foundation of the worldview of laws. He had already become an extremely secondary existence. The most obvious manifestation of this change was that if the laws in the worldview were replaced with anything else in the universe, this worldview would only need some slight adjustments to be established. Moreover, the degree of perfection might even be higher than before. Even the fundamental laws had become an existence of such status. There is naturally a world of difference between this worldview and Luo Fan's true worldview. How could the two be equated? But now, under Luo Fan's transformation, although the world's laws of this world didn't immediately change into his own, it had already begun to change in that direction. In just a few short moments, he had already achieved the status of a general from his original state of being dispensable. It had been upgraded to an irreplaceable state. Of course, although it was already irreplaceable, it was still not the true core. It was still inexplicably different from Luo Fan's true worldview. To the will of the heavens and earth, such a change was like that. It was almost painful. Don't forget how the worlds had grown into its current state. For it, which had achieved this in such a way, The change in its worldview was equivalent to the change in the foundation of its existence. If it wasn't for the fact that it was the world's will, its own level of existence was countless times stronger than that of living creatures. Such a change alone was probably enough to make it collapse completely, and all traces of its existence would be completely erased. Boom, boom, boom. As the world's will was in pain, a loud roar came from the sky. This kind of roar was different from the sound produced by the transformation of the world. It contained a kind of deep and intense pain, causing all living creatures to turn their emotions into pain after hearing this sound, regardless of their own emotions. Apart from this, Luo Fan's perspective, which was directly bestowed by the will of the heavens and earth, also began to tremble. It suddenly became blurry and suddenly became excessively clear. Suddenly, it became distorted, and suddenly, it became deformed. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan's perception ability was already extremely shocking, and that he didn't entrust all his senses to the world perspective, perhaps he would have already lost the ability to carry out this transformation of the world. Naturally, that wouldn't happen at this time. Thanks to his thoughts, the changes in the laws of this world became even more intense. The existences that belonged to the world's worldview that were hidden behind these laws also began to change even faster than before. Finally, at a certain moment, the first cultivator in this world collapsed because he couldn't bear the change in the world's worldview. With a loud bang, the area he was in was completely flattened. As this change occurred, more and more cultivators couldn't bear the change in the world's worldview, and they couldn't control the laws in their bodies anymore. This caused the laws to explode continuously, creating a huge impact. Not only did it completely erase the existences that possessed the world's worldview, but it also completely erased everything within a large area around them. In just a few days, the number of living creatures in this world had decreased by nearly 1%. 1% didn't seem like a large proportion. However, if the overall base number was increased to the state of billions of living creatures in this world, then 1% of living creatures was enough to scare anyone to death. However, there were living creatures that couldn't bear this change in the world's worldview. So naturally, there were living creatures that rose amidst this change. Their strength and realms began to increase crazily, quickly making up for the losses of those cultivators that had died. In fact, they even went one step further and increased the overall strength of this world. This was very normal. After all, because of the universality of the world's worldview, although it was suitable for almost all living creatures, it couldn't really be completely compatible with all living creatures. In this way, those living creatures that were truly compatible with the world's worldview naturally couldn't display the amount that they should have been able to display from the universality of the world's worldview. In other words, there was no way for their own strength to be raised to the peak. Under such circumstances, the world's worldview changed from a universal worldview to a true worldview. Although some of the living beings who had already engraved this universal worldview into the depths of their life source would not be able to withstand this change and completely collapse, at the same time, it would also allow these living beings who were in line with the true worldview to grow tremendously. After all, the world's will was the world's will. Even though this kind of complete change, which could even be said to destroy its foundation, appeared on its body, not long after, it was actually able to forcefully endure it by relying on its extremely high level of innate quality. Not long after, the loud rumbling sounds that came from the sky all the time disappeared without a trace. And the inexplicable changes that Luo Fan received from the world's will's perspective also began to gradually recover. Gradually, it returned to its normal state. At the same time, Luo Fan vaguely felt an indescribable help from a mysterious place and blessing him. This, clearly, it was the help from the world's will. It seemed that the world's will had already obtained enough benefits from this change. With this help, Luo Fan's transformation of this world naturally became faster, and the various body-tempering inspirations that emerged in his heart also became more exquisite. Finally, at a certain moment after an unknown number of years, his heart suddenly trembled. A A strange body appeared in his heart. This body wasn't in the shape of a human, but a strange spherical shape. This spherical shape. At first glance, it seemed to be a perfect sphere, but as long as one zoomed in and took a closer look, one would naturally be able to see that this sphere wasn't perfect at all. Every surface, every curve, and even every twist and turn contained an extremely profound and numerous mysteries. This was a body-tempering achievement. However, it wasn't the body-tempering achievement of living creatures, but the body-tempering achievement of a world. That's right, this was none other than the body-tempering achievement of Luo Fan using the perspective of the world to understand, comprehend, and deeply understand the world. Then, he combined it with the principles of cultivation and body tempering to create a body that was most suitable for the world. This body contained boundless might and boundless principles. It could even amplify the power inside this world by 1,000,000 times. It could be said that this body tempering achievement was already the pinnacle of body tempering that he had obtained in the process of countless trillions of years of cultivation. The moment this strange form appeared in his heart, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable clarity in his heart. In a trance, his mind advanced into an indescribable realm. In this realm, he could only rely on materialization and his own thoughts to outline the worldview. But now, it had turned into reality and was fully displayed in front of him. The moment he saw his worldview with his own eyes, Luo Fan felt an indescribable shame in his heart. This was because there was only one adjective that could be used to describe this worldview, and that was scattered. The worldview that appeared in front of him was like a completely uneven fog. It was quite dense here, and he could barely see his fingers if he stretched out his hand, but it was sparse there, as if there was no fog at all. It spread out and occupied every inch of space within his field of vision. No wonder I've already sorted out my worldview to this extent. That great tribulation was just a casual simulation, yet it was able to simulate an existence that was much stronger than me in this aspect. Looking at the fog in front of him, such an inexplicable thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. After this thought, he immediately took action. His heart stirred slightly, and the endless description of the worldview in front of him began to enlarge in his heart. Every bit of fog turned into a strange world that was completely composed of various descriptions. It's the foundation of time. It's the foundation of life. It's the foundation of extreme laws. Endless truths, endless descriptions, and endless mysteries drowned him in an instant. If it was the normal Luo Fan, he would have been able to keep his mind clear at this time. But now, in this realm, not only was he extremely clear-headed, but he also felt that he could completely control everything in front of him. He also felt that he could completely control everything in front of him. He could reconstruct everything in front of him according to his will and reassemble it. As he felt this, his mind began to change. In the blink of an eye, he looked at it from a more macroscopic perspective. The uneven fog in front of him began to gradually roll, and many of the fog began to combine. Many of the originally dense fog began to gradually condense in one place, and the sparse fog also began to gradually converge, gradually gathering together, and began to revolve around the edge of the dense fog. The whole scene looked somewhat similar to the process of a nebula condensing into a star in an ordinary starry sky. In the center where the dense fog was, from time to time, wisps of fog would be thrown out from it. They would converge into the surrounding fog. Moreover, from time to time, wisps of fog would be thrown out from the still scattered fog and converge into the surrounding void, becoming faintly discernible. With every change, Luo Fan felt that his understanding of the world of laws had deepened a little. He could feel every change in the scene. His strength was improving a little. In this wonderful feeling, time no longer had any meaning to him. After an unknown period of time, when Luo Fan felt that the world of laws had changed and could no longer change, he suddenly recovered. Sure enough, it has become like this. When he saw the change in the world of laws, he couldn't help but sigh, but there was an unconcealable satisfaction on his face. At this moment, The world of laws that could only be directly seen in this realm had unknowingly transformed into something that he was extremely familiar with. One looked like a sphere, but in essence, it was completely different from a sphere. It was something that he had specially sorted out and created for heaven and earth. It represented his peak achievements in body tempering, the appearance of the world after tempering his body. However, compared to the lonely sphere that he had created before, there were layers of halos around the world sphere. These halos were layered on top of each other, and the further out one went, the thinner the halos became. At the outermost edge, the halos were so weak that they were almost invisible. With a slight thought, he slowly withdrew from this realm. As he withdrew from this realm, he felt an indescribable feeling of being able to do as he pleased from the bottom of his heart. For a time, all the mysteries of the world of laws had completely turned into instinct in his heart, and even his sense of existence had become faintly discernible. This situation clearly meant that his control of the world of laws had deepened to another level. Although he didn't pay attention to time in that realm, his instincts could already tell that the time he spent in that realm was definitely not too short. It could even be calculated in the hundreds of millions of years. However, when he came out, he found that only a moment had passed in the outside world. Seeing this difference in time, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He didn't feel any pleasant surprise because of this. After all, to him, the feeling of a moment and the feeling of hundreds of millions of years were basically the same. In just a moment, when he looked at this world again, he found that he didn't even need to rely on the perspective of the world will, and he could already slightly modify this world with the world will's method. When he looked outside, he found the abnormality of the outside world. So that's the power of tribulations, and it's not the state of chaos at all. Such a thought instantly appeared in his mind. Outside this world, in the world that was about to collide with this world, what existed was not the state of chaos as he had originally thought. Instead, it was a power of tribulations that was on a lower level than the state of chaos. This power was extremely similar to the state of chaos, and it possessed all the power that the state of chaos had. The only difference was that there was a slight difference in strength. It was because of this similarity that Luo Fan had previously mistaken it for the state of chaos. It was also because of this difference in strength that he was able to distinguish it now. His gaze penetrated the state of chaos. This was obviously an impossible task for the current Luo Fan. However, although it was difficult for him to see through the power of tribulations that was slightly weaker, it was no longer impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart shook, and his eyes suddenly focused. His powerful vision pierced through the power of tribulations inch by inch, and he pushed in the direction of the other world in his memory. This kind of advancement was extremely difficult, and the speed was also extremely slow. He could only advance a few inches in a few days. According to this speed, if he wanted to truly advance to the other side of the world, he would have to spend at least several thousand years to do so. Chapter 1938. This high space-time dimension was an ocean of space-time dimensions. The innate, inextinguishable spiritual light was as conspicuous as a spark in the boundless darkness. In an instant, the endless space-time dimensions swarmed over and quickly rushed towards the man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Although the man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light could only exist for an instant, time was meaningless in this high space-time dimension. At this moment, the man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light had completely frozen its own time attribute. Although it could only exist for an instant, its existence was basically no different from other things in other space-time dimensions to all living beings and things in the outside world. In this way, the inextinguishable spiritual light would be able to interact with the other space-time dimensions and easily suppress them. The man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light's power was limitless. No matter how strong the space-time dimension was, it was not indestructible. Under the power of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, there was no way it could resist. although it rapidly surged towards the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, try to mince, assimilate, and annihilate it. In the end, it was like sending a lamb into a tiger's mouth. Under the power of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, all the space-time dimensions had no way of resisting and had already calmed down. Under this situation, the countless space-time dimensions around the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light were flattened. The originally violent state became submissive, and the surroundings were directly flattened. Then, they began to spread out in all directions at incredible speed. From afar, it looked like a dimensional ocean of space-time. Suddenly, an island that was getting bigger and bigger appeared out of nowhere. At this moment, Luo Fan had already made his move. With a slight movement in his heart, the flow of time in his body began to accelerate rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he had already experienced several years. During this period of time, compared to the collision of the two worlds, it was nothing. However, compared to the man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it was absolutely fatal. After all, the collision of the two worlds was described in terms of time span of tens of thousands of years. Compared to tens of thousands of years, it was naturally nothing. Naturally, it was nothing, and he could almost directly ignore it. However, the situation was different for the man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. For this man-made spirit light, it could only exist for an instant. It couldn't even last for a split second. A few years was enough for them to be annihilated billions of times over. At that moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. His own ability to assimilate time, which was stronger than the other Luo Fans, was instantly displayed. In that instant, the time around him froze. It began to change according to his will, and gradually it began to accelerate. This influence, it did not directly affect the entire higher space-time dimension. Instead, it relied on the uniqueness of the higher space-time dimension to begin to affect all the surrounding space-time dimensions that it could come into contact with. An invisible PU sound erupted from the surrounding lower space-time dimensions. A few years was an extremely long period of time for those ordinary and ever-changing low-dimensional space-time dimensions. This period of time was added to it. It directly caused those lower space-time dimensions to erupt with a shocking change. After this transformation, almost none of the lower space-time dimensions retained their original appearance. Even some of the lower space-time dimensions even directly collapsed due to this change. Completely perished, this influence also continued to spread in all directions, affecting more and more lower space-time dimensions. Not long after, it had already affected that special low space-time dimension. It even affected the man-made innate spiritual light that had just rushed out of that low space-time dimension. At the beginning, this influence did not have much effect on the innate spiritual light. It could even be said that it had no effect at all. The innate, inextinguishable spiritual light possessed the ability to freeze time, and it had already eliminated the assimilation, causing the assimilation to no longer have any effect on it. However, as the assimilation continued, as the special low space-time dimension with living beings in heaven and earth was gradually assimilated, the solidifying effect of the man-made, innate spiritual light also gradually lost its effect. The feeling of time flowing slowly began to appear in the man-made, innate spiritual light. Although this feeling of time flowing was still many times less than that of ordinary living beings and ordinary things, to the point that even those with less acute senses would not be able to detect the existence of this feeling of time flowing, it was still starting to flow. This clearly meant that the man-made innate spiritual light was only a matter of time before it was completely destroyed. At this moment, the man-made innate spiritual light instinctively felt that something was wrong, and it began to shake violently and struggle frantically. This was also due to its lack of intelligence. If the other Luo fans still had intelligence, it would definitely not choose to struggle at this moment. Instead, it would choose to directly treat the culprit, Luo Fan, as its target to kill. Even if it had to unleash its final attack, even if it had to abandon everything, it would still want to destroy Luo Fan before it was destroyed. However, it was a pity that it was insufficient, because it did not have enough battle intelligence. The man-made innate spiritual light completely ignored the target of its birth, Luo Fan, in the face of the horror of its own destruction. On the other hand, it only focused on fighting against its own destruction, trying its best to maintain the solidification of its own time attribute. It was a pity that the effect of time assimilation was only effective on its body because its essence came from that special low space-time dimension. Because it came from that special low space-time dimension, the change of time in that low space-time dimension was a fundamental change to it. If it wanted to fight against this change, it was equivalent to fighting against the entire world, the very foundation of its existence. Unless the man-made innate spiritual light transformed into the real innate spiritual light, it would not be able to succeed. No matter how hard it tried, it would not succeed. Therefore, at this moment, no matter how hard it tried, it could only slow down this change. They could only slow down this change, but they couldn't truly stop it. It could not change its own fate of destruction. Fortunately, at this moment, a faint smile finally appeared on Luo Fan's face, but his heart was filled with an inexplicable sense of relief. What he was glad about was that the other Luo Fan had abandoned its own intelligence. If it had retained even a trace of intelligence, things would not have gone so smoothly at this time. Facing the man-made, innate, indestructible spiritual light that was obviously much more powerful than his own, Luo Fan dealt with it in a much easier manner than any of the previous Luo Fans. The artificial connate, inextinguishable spirit light resisted for an unknown amount of time. In the end, no matter how hard the artificial connate, inextinguishable spirit light resisted, it couldn't resist the passage of time. In the end, it passed the moment it could exist. The man-made, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light had already collapsed, and in the blink of an eye, it had completely turned into bits and pieces that were being devoured by the surrounding low-dimensional space. When the last trace of the man-made, innate spiritual light was completely devoured by the surrounding low space-time dimension, Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh of relief. Without intelligence to control power, no matter how strong it is, it will not be of much use. A kind of enlightenment emerged in his heart. Immediately afterward, with a thought, he activated his law power and began to communicate with the low space-time dimension that had devoured the man-made, innate spiritual light fragments, causing them to collide with each other. The collision of the two innate, inextinguishable spirit lights had various possible outcomes. But, under Luo Fan's guidance, nothing else could happen except for the destruction of each other. Loud rumbling sounds constantly erupted from the space-time dimension ocean. It constantly entered Luo Fan's ears after an unknown period of time, when he finally destroyed all the low space-time dimension that had devoured the man-made, innate spiritual light fragments. He finally relaxed completely. Seeing that there were no more strange phenomena, he didn't stay any longer. With a sway of his body, he stepped into the special, low space-time dimension. After arriving here, he looked up at the sky, only to see that the sky was gloomy as if a storm was coming. It seems there is no will of heaven and earth in this world, he muttered inwardly and sighed. He began to take action. With a thought, wisps of law power rushed out of his body. This pushed the world, which had already become broken due to the destruction of the world of laws, further into the abyss of destruction. The power of law was an extremely high-end and powerful force. This kind of power was even many times stronger than the power that Luo Fan had condensed. This kind of power concentrated on restraining other characteristics and only transformed them into the destruction attribute, constantly destroying the surroundings. It goes without saying how terrifying this kind of power was. For a time, the entire world, starting from where he stood, began to shatter layer by layer. Time, space, matter, and energy these four basic existences also began to become chaotic. In this way, the creatures that had escaped from the previous chaos were once again met with a calamity of annihilation. Moreover, this time, it was a real disaster that no longer had any chance of survival. Although there was no will of heaven and earth itself still had a tendency and a mechanism similar to the survival instinct. At this moment, countless forces condensed in the sky, and terrifying lightning constantly fell from the sky, bombarding the place where Luo Fan was. Under this bombardment, heaven and earth moved one step closer to destruction. However, the target of the bombardment, the one who caused the destruction of this world, Luo Fan, who was the culprit in the eyes of heaven and earth, wasn't affected in the process at all. At least, it didn't seem to be too obvious. He merely condensed a wave of law power above his head and transformed it into a magical cloud. That was enough to naturally block all the lightning bolts and completely nullify all the attacks that came from the sky. Not even his clothes were lifted up in the slightest. Heaven and earth naturally reacted, and countless flames suddenly surged out from the ground and began to madly rush towards him, wanting to burn him to death. However, this kind of flame was even worse than the lightning. The lightning could still slightly shake the auspicious cloud. It caused the auspicious cloud to tremble slightly a few times above his head. The endless flames couldn't even do that. When they were a few dozen feet away from his body, they became powerless. In the end, when they were a few feet away from his body, they had already completely disappeared, unable to move him at all. This kind of attack failed, and heaven and earth reacted again, changing to heavy water that could melt everything. It fell from the sky, gushed out from the ground, and condensed from the void. It wanted to drown and destroy him with all means. However, it was obvious that all of this was to no avail. During this process, Luo Fan's expression didn't change at all. He directly ignored this kind of impact, and so on. That heaven and earth. Time and time again, he changed the way he attacked Luo Fan. Time and time again, he changed the way he attacked Luo Fan. It really exhausted the imagination of all living beings. All kinds of changes were subtle and mysterious. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in admiration when he saw it. Of course, it was just admiration. After this admiration, he still did what he had to do. He still did what he had to do to resist. And the final result, he was unscathed. This attack of heaven and earth. Instead, it weakened little by little. In the end, by the time Luo Fan had destroyed 80% of this part of the world, the countless attacks that were aimed at him finally couldn't appear anymore. Dian Dian's attack, which didn't have much effect, was completely unrestrained. As this attack dissipated, Luo Fan's destruction of this part of the world was no longer obstructed. Finally, in an even shorter time, he completely destroyed the remaining 20% of this part of the world. The moment this part of the world was completely destroyed, an indescribable suction suddenly acted on Luo Fan's body. Following this suction, he suddenly felt that the vision of the world's will, which was originally one with him and no longer separated, started to quickly pull away. As this pulled away, his clone that was formed from two different perspectives started to rapidly collapse. Is this a trap? At this moment, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As this thought flashed through his mind, the vision of the world that was fused with his clone was completely pulled away. As the vision was pulled away, his clone also completely collapsed at the same time, as if it had never appeared in the first place. His own vision suffered a huge impact from the power of the tribulation and collapsed in the blink of an eye. In the end, it couldn't withstand the power of the tribulation and the huge impact caused by the destruction of this part of the world. However, at this time, what Luo Fan cared about was obviously not this point of view. His attention had already shifted to where his main body was at this moment. Here, he was floating in the void, and in front of him was still the intact part of the world. This part of the world seemed to be extremely compatible with his worldview. At this moment, a huge vortex appeared in the sky. After this vortex appeared, rumbling sounds kept coming from it. To other living beings, these sounds were only sounds that could cause their emotions to change, be it fear, excitement, anger, or gratitude. However, for Luo Fan, these sounds were completely different. Through his perception of the worldview of laws, he could clearly hear that this voice contained words that belonged to the will of the world. "I've finally succeeded." This was what the worlds will said. Following this sentence, the huge vortex began to spin frantically. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly sensed that outside the world, within the power of the tribulation, there were countless objects that were rapidly moving towards this part of the world in this vortex. Devour? Luo Fan frowned. If it was just devouring, there was no need to immediately abandon him and do it. Could it be that there was a deeper secret behind this devouring? With this thought in mind, he didn't hesitate to urge his own vision and began to see the power of the tribulation spreading over. He didn't know if it was because he had already experienced it once, or because his vision had improved after his battle with the other Luo Fan. In short, when he thought about the power of the tribulation spreading through his vision, he felt much more relaxed. The speed at which he was moving forward had also increased a lot. It didn't take long for him to see the chaotic fragments of the world within the power of the tribulations heading towards him. Of course, apart from his own vision extending into the power of the tribulation, the fragment had already passed through a large amount of the power of the tribulation and was approaching this part of the world. Luo Fan's complexion suddenly changed the moment he saw the fragment of heaven and earth. Damn it! It's absorbing the power of the tribulation. This thought instantly emerged in his mind. With this thought, he rushed up without hesitation. In the blink of an eye, his figure crossed the barriers of time and space and appeared directly in front of the power of the tribulation. His power of laws erupted in an instant and directly poured into the power of the tribulation. It quickly condensed imitations of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light in front of the power of the tribulation and turned into pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that brazenly blasted towards the fragment. Chapter 1939. In the blink of an eye, within the power of the tribulation, the fragments of the world that were rushing towards this part of the world abruptly drew a mysterious arc in the void. At the critical moment, they actually penetrated Luo Fan's defensive layer in a seemingly simple but actually exquisite way and brazenly attacked this part of the world. Or, to be more specific, it was heading for Luo Fan, who had just appeared in front of this world. Luo Fan was secretly horrified by this oncoming terror. The law power in his body trembled and started to erupt. Endless power was released in an instant and rushed towards the world fragment that was coming for him. During this process, this power kept changing the surrounding space-time, the surrounding nomological laws, and even the power of the tribulation. The ultimate goal of all these changes was to shatter the world fragment. That's right, to shatter the world fragment once again. Originally, it would have been the easiest and simplest method to shift the heaven and earth fragment to another direction that would not affect him and would not harm him. But obviously, this wasn't his target at this moment. This was because the most important thing for him now was to stop the plan of the will of heaven and earth. The will of heaven and earth absorbing the power of the tribulation that was contained in the world fragment was its plan. Luo Fan's magical power of laws was infinitely profound and powerful. Through the external environment, it naturally evolved all kinds of corresponding characteristics, turning into endless brilliance, forming endless images, and pouncing towards the fragment of heaven and earth. Under the control of the will of heaven and earth, the world fragment also underwent countless changes. As it changed, it erupted with a shocking power that collided with the power derived from Luo Fan's law of dermic power. In an instant, the world changed color. Even the power of the tribulation created a huge ripple at this moment. It started to spread in all directions. The power of the tribulation could even give birth to such a perfect world and give birth to another existence like Luo Fan. Its profoundness was self-evident. Right now, the ripples produced by such power would naturally not be like the ripples produced on the surface of a calm lake, which would only spread out in circles and disappear. In that instant, countless existences were born within the power of the tribulation. These existences came in all shapes and sizes. Some of them looked extremely ferocious. Some were completely useless. At least, they were completely useless in battle. All of this blended together, accompanied by ripples, constantly spreading in all directions. At first glance, it seemed as if a new world had been created. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribably terrifying power pouring into his body through his law power, starting to detonate from the inside out. Even if his body had reached an incredible level of toughness under the support of the condensed worldview of laws, it still couldn't help him. In the face of such an earth-shattering explosion, it still seemed so fragile. In the blink of an eye, his body exploded and turned into a puff of thick smoke that rapidly churned on the spot. It was as if he was trying his best to reform, but he couldn't return to his original appearance, no matter how hard he tried. However, compared to Luo Fan's powerful injuries, the fragment of heaven and earth didn't fare much better. At this moment, it had completely shattered and turned into smoke. Along with the ripples of the power of the tribulation, it began to disintegrate and spread in all directions. The power of the tribulation itself was an extremely high-end and powerful force. Such power naturally wasn't like the calm lake water that could be devoured at will. Previously, the fragment of heaven and earth could devour the power of the tribulation. That was because the fragment of heaven and earth itself was powerful enough to completely devour the power of the tribulation. But the situation now was obviously completely different. Now, the fragment of heaven and earth had been further shattered as it collided with the power derived from Luo Fan's law power. Now, the size of each fragment was less than a millionth of its original size. Naturally, its power had weakened to less than a millionth of its original size. With such a change, the suppressive force that it originally possessed was naturally gone. Without the suppressive force, the dominant and passive forces were completely reversed. The one that had the upper hand was the power of the tribulation. Therefore, the fragment of heaven and earth was devoured by the power of the tribulation instead at this moment. The will of heaven and earth only said indifferently, "You can block it once, but can you block it 100 times?" At this moment, the pulling force that erupted from the vortex suddenly increased by several times. As it increased, Luo Fan felt that the fragment of heaven and earth that was coming from the depths of the power of the tribulation had accelerated once again. "How can I let you get what you want?" The smoke that Luo Fan had turned into said. Following that, the power of the infinite laws began to emanate from the smoke and quickly condensed the smoke into a human figure. A living Luo Fan, who didn't look any different from the original, came out. For Luo Fan, who had the concept of immortality, the explosion of his body was only a small problem. It didn't affect him much at all. He could recover at any time if he wanted to. At this moment, the huge vortex shook and Luo Fan suddenly felt the laws around his body start to change. An indescribable repulsion was produced from the laws and acted on his body, pushing him into the power of the tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan snorted coldly. "Don't forget, I was the one who modified this world." Following this voice, the rules and laws that came into contact with him began to change rapidly. Suddenly, they completely betrayed the will of the world and transformed into a completely different form of existence. It was as if they had extended out from the worldview of the world. During this transformation, the repulsion produced by the laws around him naturally disappeared completely. On the contrary, it turned into another inexplicable sound, just like his tentacles. It began to spread in all directions and gradually began to affect the surrounding heaven and earth, causing the surrounding heaven and earth to gradually turn into an existence similar to his domain. Instead, it began to reject the will of heaven and earth. Zhang Xian chuckled. A chuckle sounded from the vortex. Immediately after, the countless laws began to tremble violently. Amidst this trembling, Luo Fan felt a powerful force continuously transmitted to his heart, constantly impacting his body and his power. It was impacting his law power. In a trance, he felt as if his body was about to break free from his control. The body and the will were two existences that affected each other. When the will was stronger than the body's instincts, the will would naturally control the body. However, at a certain moment, when the body's instincts were strengthened to an unimaginable level, the body's instincts would in turn affect the will and control it. In the end, the will would act according to the body's instincts. Now, as the creator of this world, Luo Fan's relationship with this world was equivalent to the will of the body. In contrast, the original will of this world was like the instinct of this world. Just now, Luo Fan relied on the power of his will to manipulate the laws of this world. Time and space were reconstructed according to his will, which was equivalent to the will controlling the body. However, at this moment, when the body's instincts were stimulated to the extreme, which meant that the will of heaven and earth continued to increase its power and strengthen its control over heaven and earth. It was equivalent to the body's instincts gradually suppressing his will. In this way, the situation would naturally be reversed, and the will would be affected by the body's instincts instead. Luo Fan's thoughts raced, and in the blink of an eye, he had already figured out this problem. His expression changed, and with a soft shout, he brazenly cut off his connection with this world. As he cut off this connection, the feeling that his body was gradually getting out of control and was about to completely lose control naturally dissipated. However, the repulsive force produced by the laws also returned naturally, constantly acting on his body, oppressing him and impacting him. It took him a lot of effort to stabilize his body. Just as he was competing with the will of heaven and earth for the authority to control the laws, the hundreds of fragments of heaven and earth that were rushing straight towards him had already pounced on him. Even though Luo Fan's reaction speed was fast and his response was extremely accurate, he only had time to condense thousands of worlds of laws in front of him to resist the impact of the fragments of heaven and earth before he was hit by the fragments of heaven and earth. His entire body flew backwards like a meteor. During this process, endless power rushed into his body, constantly destroying everything in his body. Even his concept of existence was within the scope of that destruction. In the face of such a terrifying upheaval, how could Luo Fan have the time to pay attention to anything else? At this moment, he could only wholeheartedly expel the destructive power that was pouring into his body, work hard to maintain his body's integrity, and support his concept of existence. At this moment, the will of heaven and earth no longer seemed to be in the mood to care about him. The huge vortex that appeared in the center of heaven and earth began to spin frantically. Countless fragments of heaven and earth collided into it, and were continuously minced and devoured by the vortex. Every time a fragment of heaven and earth was minced and devoured, the vortex seemed to become much deeper, and the speed of its rotation also seemed to slightly accelerate. The entire world began to churn rapidly due to this change, and the traces that Luo Fan had left in this world began to be gradually expelled and eliminated during this process. Although this change was intense, it was on a much higher level than all the living beings except for Luo Fan. At this moment, in the face of such a change, none of the living beings could sense it. For the living beings, apart from the vortex in the sky that was constantly changing, there were no other changes in this part of the world. Everything was so natural. While the world was changing, all the living beings in it were also changing at the same time. This was like a person on a fast-moving train, and it was difficult to notice that the train was moving just by looking inside. Without Luo Fan to obstruct it, more and more fragments of heaven and earth appeared. The power of the tribulation carried with it an endless amount of tribulation power that constantly rushed into the world and was minced up by the vortex formed by the will of heaven and earth. It kept absorbing. In this way, from the outside world, it looked like the power of the tribulation had suddenly formed a tornado that continuously poured into this part of the world, causing this part of the world to continuously expand. It looked like a balloon being blown up. At this moment, Luo Fan had already been blasted into the ground by the collision of heaven and earth. He kept drilling into the depths of the ground, causing the ground to churn and his body to explode from the inside out. The scene was so tragic that no one could bear to see it. However, all this on the surface was nothing to him. The most important thing to him now was that he was suffering an endless blow on a conceptual level. In other words, his concept of survival was under attack. This kind of attack could cause absolute damage to any existence with the undying attribute. It was the same for him. If I can't block it, I will die. At this moment, Luo Fan had an unprecedented strong premonition. He had encountered attacks that involved the concept of existence many times in his countless battles. However, what he had experienced in the past, none of the attacks that involved concepts had been as direct and intense as this one. None of them had been. It had given him such a strong sense of crisis. At this moment, all the changes in the outside world had completely disappeared from his senses. They could no longer leave any traces in his heart. His mind had already entered the conceptual level, and he saw the various concepts that couldn't be described with words. In this concept, his concept of existence occupied the center, like a dot of green in a field of flowers. However, at this moment, this dot of green was swaying in the endless surrounding concepts. It was like a candle in a storm that could be extinguished at any time. Around this concept of existence, endless concepts were like landslides and tsunamis, madly pouncing on his concept of existence. They wanted to assimilate and destroy his concept of existence. My concept of existence is so weak. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. In fact, his concept of existence wasn't too weak in absolute terms. It could even be said that it was strong enough that it couldn't be shaken by ordinary cultivators. However, compared to his physical body, to his life essence, to his strength, to his cultivation realm, the concept of existence was too different. In Luo Fan's perception, his concept of existence could at most barely be considered to be compatible with the cultivation realm of a false saint. It was really a world of difference from his current realm. Perhaps this will be another opportunity for me. In an instant, this ridiculous thought appeared in his mind. Then, he smiled bitterly and dispelled this thought. From a certain point of view, this encounter was indeed a kind of opportunity for him. After all, it was usually very difficult for him to eliminate all other influences to directly see this concept of existence. Only at this moment, when his concept of existence itself was in a huge crisis, would his potential erupt, allowing him to surpass the boundaries and see the conceptual level that was originally invisible. This gave him a chance to operate, giving him a chance to strengthen his concept of existence and make up for the weakness that he couldn't make up for. However, obviously, the basis of all this was that he could ensure that his concept of existence wouldn't disappear in this kind of crisis. If even the concept of existence itself had disappeared, then even if this was a good opportunity, even if this opportunity could bring him many benefits, so what? If even the concept of existence was gone, there would no longer be any traces of his existence in the hearts of all living beings in this world. At that time, even the living beings themselves wouldn't feel anything, and their memories of Luo Fan would completely disappear. In that case, even if this opportunity was strong enough to let him become a true saint, so what? At this time, Luo Fan focused all of his mind, all of his energy, and all of his willpower on his concept of existence. He tried his best to strengthen his concept of existence, to resist the impact of the countless concepts around him. This resistance was unimaginably painful. If an ordinary cultivator came to this level, enduring any moment would be enough to break through the limit of their pain tolerance and make their soul collapse. They wouldn't even need the concept of existence to be destroyed before they would die. Even for Luo Fan, this kind of pain was not easy to bear. In this instant, his thinking ability seemed to have suffered a destructive blow. Unknowingly, he had already become muddle-headed, and even the thought of relieving the pain could not be borne. Chapter 1940. Just as the concept of Luo Fan's existence was gradually submerged and eliminated, everyone who remembered Luo Fan's memories of Luo Fan were gradually fading, regardless of which world they were in or which period of time they were in. Even the Sky Maiden, who was cultivating in the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, was the same. Moreover, all of this happened silently. Even the Sky Maiden, who was cultivating, didn't notice the change at all. Facing such a tragic situation, Luo Fan didn't feel anything at all. He didn't even realize it. For him, trying his best to maintain the concept of his existence had already exhausted all his willpower and perception. His perception of time had already disappeared at some point in time. While his concept of existence was constantly being attacked and weakened, his perception of other concepts was also constantly strengthening. All concepts outside of himself were unprecedentedly strengthened in his perception. He had never sensed the existence of other concepts as clearly as he did now. Everything was like a brand new world to him. A brand new, but deadly world. For him, this world was hovering between life and death. Every moment, he crossed the line of life and death and tried his best to struggle back. However, each time, the strength of his struggle became weaker and weaker. Each time he struggled back, it became more and more difficult in a daze. He didn't know how much time had passed. It seemed like hundreds of millions of years, but it also seemed like only an instant. On the conceptual level, his concept of existence had already been reduced to a state where it was faintly discernible. His mind sank deeper and deeper. His perception of the concept of the outside world had become so clear that it had even replaced his own concept of existence. However, his perception of his own concept of existence had also reached the edge of being completely cut off. He had achieved it. It was even weaker than the last bit of clarity in his mind. Under such circumstances, his life was in danger of truly dying out. At this moment, his last bit of potential was finally aroused. In that boundless pain and limitless drowsiness, he reignited the last bit of clarity. What came with this clarity was the view of the world that he had long since turned into a deep-rooted understanding of. In that instant, the remnants of his mind completely eliminated all unimportant thoughts. Only his understanding of the world and his perception of the concept remained. The reason why he retained his worldview was that this worldview had long become his most fundamental existence and had become a completely inseparable part of him. As for the conceptual level, it was needless to say. This was the level he was in right now, the source of his life and death crisis, and also the key to his rebirth. How could it not be left behind? Concept, worldview. In an instant, Luo Fan suddenly realized how much time he had wasted. In fact, the solution to his current life and death crisis was very simple, and that was to strengthen his own concept of existence. This point, from the very beginning, Luo Fan was clear about it. But all along, he didn't even think of how to strengthen it. It wasn't until now that he had eliminated all other thoughts, leaving only the worldview and the fire of induction at the level of the concept car, that he suddenly came to a realization. Wasn't the best way to strengthen his own concept of existence to integrate his own worldview into it? Luo Fan established a unique worldview that belonged entirely to himself. From the very beginning, it was to allow himself to resist the state of chaos, to allow himself to be eroded and assimilated by the terrifying state of chaos. He could still continue to exist, although it wasn't a direct target. But the fundamental goal was obviously this concept of existence. In that case, now that his concept of existence was too weak, it didn't match his true strength, then wasn't the only correct way to directly add the worldview of laws to it? Thinking of this, Luo Fan didn't dare to stay any longer. With a slight movement in his heart, his worldview began to constantly transcend and improve, quickly approaching the conceptual level. The conceptual level itself was an extremely high level. Even for Luo Fan, if he didn't encounter a direct impact on the conceptual level and didn't feel a huge threat to his concept of existence, it was very likely that he would be damaged and die. Even he wouldn't be able to advance to this conceptual level at this time. Therefore, for him, wanting to raise his worldview of laws to this conceptual level and let it directly add to his own concept of existence was extremely difficult. It was as difficult as ordinary people trying to reach the sky in one step. However, for him now, no matter how difficult it was, this was already his last hope. Therefore, even if he felt extremely huge resistance, even if he felt that achieving his goal was so illusory, he still didn't feel discouraged and continued to move forward towards this goal, doing everything he could to achieve that goal. Even if the entire process seemed to be a futile effort, it was still the case. In fact, even if it seemed like he was doing useless work to add the worldview of laws to the concept of existence, in fact, on another level, he had already achieved great success. That was the existence of his concept of existence. The most obvious manifestation of this was that his concept of existence had stopped diminishing and weakening. In a way, his life and death crisis could be considered to have been temporarily resolved. However, at this time, Luo Fan didn't care about this at all. At this time, he had already put all his attention on raising the worldview level to add to his concept of existence. Only by focusing all his attention on it would he be able to obtain such benefits and stop the weakening of his concept of existence. Otherwise, if he were to make even the slightest mistake, his progress would naturally be lost, and his concept of existence would definitely weaken once again in a trance. Time gradually passed. At least, it was the time that belonged to Luo Fan himself. Time gradually began to pass. 1 day, 2 days, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 10 million years, 100 million years, 1 billion years, 10 billion years, 1,000,000,000,000 years. Although he had the special ability to equate an instant with 1,000,000,000,000 years, that special ability was only complete in his mind. Only when his will was complete could it be effective. And now it was obvious. He was only left with the perception of the concept level and the understanding of the worldview. Putting aside the fact that his spirit and will were complete, it was doubtful whether they even existed or not. How could someone like him equate 100 trillion years with an instant? Therefore, during this period of time, the time that belonged to him, every minute and second passed. It was completely reflected on his body, reflected in the essence of his life. Under such circumstances, even if he didn't have a complete will or perfect thinking ability, he gradually developed an inexplicable sense of vicissitudes. During this process, Luo Fan's desire to survive that surpassed everything was displayed incisively and vividly. Trillions of years, time passed one after another, but his mind never wavered because of the passage of time. He never had the thought of retreating because he couldn't see any progress. After who knew how many trillions of years, his concept of existence finally faintly carried a hint of the charm of the worldview. Although it was only a trace of charm, it was already a qualitative improvement. Its existence instantly caused Luo Fan's concept of existence to suddenly emit a sense of stability that was unique to it. With the appearance of this sense of stability, the concept of existence finally reversed development for the first time since Luo Fan stepped into this concept level. It changed from the original dim to bright again. With this change in trend, more senses appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With the appearance of the senses, his reason and his thinking ability recovered a little bit. He instinctively knew that he was walking on the right path. At that moment, he restrained his mind and continued to focus on the original continuous work of adding the worldview to his concept of existence. With the first taste, the difficulty of his concept of existence being added to the worldview had been reduced by 1 level. Next, in the span of trillion years, he once again allowed his concept of existence to be added. The feeling of the worldview that was revealed in the concept of existence began to improve a little bit. The chain reaction brought about by this was that his concept of existence was once again lit up a little. His mind, his ability to think, once again recovered a little bit. Luo Fan, who instinctively discovered that this was effective, naturally didn't hesitate. He once again poured everything he had into it. Just like that, 1 trillion years passed, 2 trillion years passed, 10 trillion years passed. Finally, after an unknown number of trillions of years, at a certain moment, he made up for the last bit that was blocking his complete thinking and complete consciousness. Finally, after sinking into this concept level for an unknown number of trillions of years, he regained his consciousness for the first time. At this moment, Luo Fan's complete consciousness exhaled a long breath, and an inexplicable joy surged from the bottom of his heart. This is the true performance of the third great calamity. Such a thought emerged. Every time he faced a great tribulation, it was a struggle between life and death, a struggle to climb out of death. Ever since he encountered the third tribulation, although he was constantly facing danger, those dangers were still within his bearable range. It was so much so that he only needed to scheme a little before he could successfully get through it. Compared to the previous two great tribulations, where he narrowly escaped death each time, the difference was really too great. It wasn't until this time, when the concept of his own existence was greatly impacted and could collapse and disappear at any time, that he once again found the feeling of passing through the two great tribulations. This was not something to be happy about. In fact, it could even be said to be something that could make one despair. However, the appearance of this situation dispelled the last bit of worry in his heart. It dispelled the anxiety that he originally had about what would happen next in the third great trial. From his point of view, for him, this could be considered as a joyous occasion. As his thoughts spun, he began to focus his attention on this conceptual level. In this plane, his concept of existence, his appearance had completely changed. Now, this concept of existence had turned into a sphere surrounded by a halo. Just like his worldview, endless light was released from the center of the conceptual level, illuminating the entire conceptual level and affecting all the concepts in this conceptual level. The entire sphere with a halo was none other than the appearance of the worldview that he had already condensed, combined with the incomparably strong charm of the worldview that was revealed on it. At first glance, it was as if he was looking at a completely different view of the world. I finally barely managed to do it. Looking at the changes in the concept of existence and feeling the sense of stability that came from the bottom of his heart, Luo Fan let out a long sigh. Although it was still not perfect, now his concept of existence could be considered to be in line with his realm. His weaknesses could also be considered to have been preliminarily made up for. His thoughts turned, and his senses spread out in other directions on this conceptual level. Soon, he noticed an extremely special concept in the distance. This concept was extremely huge. If Luo Fan's concept of existence was said to be just a small ping-pong ball, then that concept would be as big as the Earth. Its enormity was self-evident. After discovering this special concept, Luo Fan completely understood what he had encountered before. The infinite impact and endless crushing of the concept of existence that the paper had endured for at least 1 trillion years came from that huge concept. So that's it. No wonder the impact was so unbearable. Sighing in his heart, Luo Fan suddenly controlled his own concept of existence. Very slowly, it moved towards the huge concept. Although that special concept was unimaginably huge, it was impossible to imagine. But just by looking at it now, one could tell that its strength was far inferior to Luo Fan's concept of existence at this time. Under such circumstances, if the two collided, as long as the method was correct, then Luo Fan's concept of existence would definitely win. And now, what Luo Fan had to do was to make his concept of existence win. The reason why he made this decision was very simple. Because when he saw this huge concept, he already knew what it was. After all, at the bottom of it all the attacks he'd suffered during the third Great Tribulation had come from the third Great Tribulation. And the impact and crushing of the concepts he had encountered before was the source of this huge concept in front of him. In this way, it was obvious that the concept in front of him was the concept of the third Great Tribulation. In fact, it was very likely that it was the concept of the third Great Tribulation. In this case, as long as he could shatter this huge concept and completely eliminate it, the third Great Tribulation would completely dissipate, and he would be able to easily pass through the subsequent changes of the tribulations. Unfortunately, Luo Fan's realm was still not high enough to step into the concept level. At this time, even if he sensed this level through the sense of crisis, he still couldn't control his concept of existence at will. Therefore, although his will was extremely strong and he had already done his best to control his concept of existence, the movement speed of his concept of existence was still extremely slow. Just looking at the speed, although it was slightly faster than when he used the worldview of laws to enhance his concept of existence, it wasn't much faster. After roughly measuring the distance between the two concepts, Luo Fan found that it would take at least tens of billions of years for his concept of existence to reach the huge concept that was likely to be the concept of the third Great Tribulation. Although it's a little long, it's still acceptable. After making a rough calculation, Luo Fan smiled faintly and accepted it without the slightest complaint. Now his thoughts and will were absolutely complete, and the special ability to equate an instant with 100 trillion years had reappeared in him. In this way, tens of billions of years were equivalent to tens of thousands of instant for him. It wasn't even a breath, so what was the big deal? Moreover, apart from the fact that time was nothing, he could also rely on this period of time to work hard to enhance his worldview of laws on his concept of existence, so that his concept of existence could become stronger and more powerful before the two concepts collided. The entire concept level seemed to only have his own consciousness. Although the entire concept level was colorful, unpredictable, and extremely lively, he didn't sense the existence of any intelligence. Even if he released his perception to the limit, all he sensed were very ordinary concepts. This was very likely to cause the only existence of loneliness. But obviously, this situation couldn't happen to Luo Fan, who could even ignore time and carry out the equivalent. To him, this extremely lonely conceptual plane was simply like a boundless treasure vault, and there were boundless resources and treasures waiting for him to obtain and excavate. As time passed, and he continued to move forward, his understanding of the concept of existence continued to deepen. Chapter 1941. Hundreds of billions of years passed in the blink of an eye. Unknowingly, Luo Fan had already pushed his own concept of existence and arrived at the place where the huge concept was located. In other words, after spending enough time to make almost all other cultivators despair, he had finally achieved his goal. After experiencing this long journey, Luo Fan's comprehension of the concept had unknowingly reached a certain extreme. At a glance, although the entire concept was still the same as before, it had completely changed in his eyes. From the original mystery, it had turned into all kinds of information that he could understand. It was as if it had changed from chaos to a normal world, a normal space-time, hundreds of billions of years. How long was this time? If ordinary creatures were to imagine it, just counting it would be enough to make their hair turn white. Such a long time was used to comprehend the entire concept. Even if the concept was profound, unfathomable, and extraordinary, he would inevitably have his own understanding of it. He would definitely have his own understanding of every concept in the entire concept. This kind of understanding might not necessarily be correct, but it was enough to make the concept in his eyes undergo an earth-shattering change. In this way, the most obvious change was that he could now enter and exit this concept at will. In other words, if he wanted to, he could directly leave this conceptual level, and in the next instant, he could easily step into this conceptual level based on his own thoughts. This kind of improvement could almost be said to be a qualitative improvement. In this way, it was enough to make him almost an invincible existence in front of all existences that couldn't reach the concept by relying on his understanding of concepts over the past 10 trillion years. He had gained a great deal of experience. He had already determined that the huge concept in front of him was the concept of the existence of the third great calamity. No matter what it was in the calamity, even if it was the will of the world, and even if it was the other Luo fan. Their existences belonged to this huge concept in front of him. In other words, as long as he destroyed this huge concept, then everything in the third great calamity would completely disappear. Even the memories in the hearts of all living beings would completely disappear. As for it itself, it was not born of the Great Tribulation. However, it was affected by the great calamity and devoured by it, turning into a will of the world that could resist Luo Fan's methods. Although its concept of existence was not the same as the concept of existence of the third great calamity. However, the instant it was controlled by the tribulation, its own existence had already been absorbed into the third tribulation. Therefore, once the concept of the great calamity's existence disappeared, the concept of its own existence would no longer exist. However, from Luo Fan's point of view, Luo Fan's eyes were filled with disdain. He had been stuck in that conceptual level for countless trillions of years. But in reality, his own time was completely separated from the time in the outside world. In other words, for that part of the world in the great calamity, it was not a small world. For the will of heaven and earth, the flow of time was completely unrelated to the flow of time that Luo Fan had experienced. In reality, at this moment, only a few tens of thousands of years had passed in that world. The will of heaven and earth had not even completely absorbed all the fragments of the world in the other world. At this moment, that region of the world had completely changed. The original prosperity had completely disappeared. What replaced it was desolation and desolation. It was as if all the vitality in this world had been used up. This scene, over the years, every time the fragments of the world plunged into the world, it caused the entire world to shake violently. It caused the laws of the world to undergo some kind of change, big or small, so that all living beings had no time to adapt to it. If it was in the past, when the will of heaven and earth wholeheartedly wanted to protect this world, it would naturally use all kinds of methods to help stabilize the laws of the world. This would give all living beings more time to adapt to the changes in the laws of the world and evolve to become stronger. But now, it was clear that the will of heaven and earth, which was wholeheartedly focused on absorbing the power of the tribulations and finally transcending the tribulations, did not have the mood to care about the living beings in this world. All its thoughts and were focused on continuously drawing in the fragments of the world to absorb more of the power of the tribulations. If not for that, how could it not have the mood to care about Luo Fan after falling into the depths of this world for so long? It was precisely because of this that the current situation was created. In just a few tens of thousands of years, this world had already turned into this barren state. But on this day, an indescribable sense of danger suddenly surged in the will of heaven and earth senses. The will of heaven and earth's way of thinking was completely different from living beings. Normally speaking, living beings could not understand its existence at all. However, the will of heaven and earth in front of it was different from all other wills of heaven and earth. It had experienced falling time and time again, becoming a will of heaven and earth again and again, being lifted up and pulled back to the level of the will of heaven and earth. Now, it was working hard to absorb the endless power of the tribulations for its own transcendence and its own freedom. In this state, its way of thinking already carried the characteristics of many living beings. Only in this way would it be afraid of its disappearance like living beings, and pursue its own transcendence like living beings. Under such circumstances, when it sensed this sudden sense of danger, its reaction was rather similar to that of a living creature. It stopped absorbing the fragments of the world and began to thoroughly investigate everything that it could sense. It thoroughly investigated everything that could possibly cause it to have this kind of feeling. The will of heaven and earth was, after all, the will of heaven and earth. Soon, it had locked its target on Luo Fan, who had completely disappeared from its will for tens of thousands of years. Rumble, voices of questioning echoed between the heavens and the earth. The loud rumbling sound penetrated the ground, penetrated the rules and laws, and blasted where Luo Fan was, who seemed to have turned into a fossil. This sound was, after all, the voice of the will of heaven and earth. Among them, naturally, it contained unimaginably terrifying power. Under the transmission of this power, Luo Fan, who seemed to have turned into a fossil, trembled slightly, and countless cracks appeared on its surface. The flesh inside was finally revealed again. As the flesh was revealed, a faintly discernible vitality seeped out. It was also at this moment that the will of heaven and earth discovered that Luo Fan, whom it thought was on the verge of death, still had such a strong vitality. How was this the appearance of someone on the verge of death? It could be said that he was in his peak condition. How was this possible? The rumbling voice contained such thoughts. Luo Fan did not die. That was to be expected. After all, the tribulation this time and the endless tribulation power in the surroundings existed because of Luo Fan's existence. If Luo Fan had died, then the tribulation would naturally disperse, and the power of the tribulation would naturally disappear. How could it continue to appear here? How could it continue to wait for it to continue absorbing? However, after suffering the direct impact of the tribulation power and being weakened to the limit, Luo Fan could continue to live. He should be constantly struggling on the edge of life and death, right? How could it be like this with not much loss at all? At this moment, the will of heaven and earth finally became anxious. It did not seem to vent its anger. The laws of this world were already pushed by it. Endless power began to flow and circulate in this world in some indescribable way. In the sky, the huge vortex began to brew with endless sounds, and endless power surged. Suddenly, a boundless and terrifying power rushed straight down from the center of the vortex and brazenly smashed down on Luo Fan. This terrifying power was the refinement of the tribulation power. Compared to the power of ordinary tribulations, it was millions of times stronger. As soon as this power appeared in this world, it had completely destroyed the space-time within a range of billions of light years. Even the most basic and minute fragments could not be preserved. It was as if the space-time within a radius of who knew how many billions of light years did not exist at all. Such terrifying might naturally surpass the power of time. It felt like the moment it appeared, or even before it appeared, it had already smashed into Luo Fan's body. Under this kind of terrifying power, Luo Fan's body didn't have any ability to resist. It collapsed with a loud bang, turning into countless fragments. Like billowing smoke, it began to roll in all directions. This fragility, this straightforwardness, made people almost unable to believe their eyes. It's that easy? The will of heaven and earth had indescribable doubts at this moment. However, it soon realized that it wasn't going to be that easy, because at this moment, the tribulation was still present, and the power of the tribulation was still surging in the surroundings, producing all sorts of terrifying noises and exploding earth-shattering might that surged in all directions. This situation clearly told it that the main body of the tribulation was still alive. The power of the tribulation was completely targeted at Luo Fan, so the power that had erupted was naturally the most destructive and terrifying power against him. Under such a bombardment, Luo Fan's death should have been the most complete, and he wouldn't have had any chance to resist at all. But now, it seemed like he had indeed died and disappeared. However, all external connections showed that he was still alive. This caused the will of heaven and earth to finally develop an incomprehensible emotion. The will of heaven and earth was extremely puzzled, but the tribulation itself wouldn't be like this. Its instinctive reaction caused its power to continuously spread and increase, gradually approaching the level of the concept. That's right, at this moment, everything that Luo Fan existed in the real world had indeed been completely erased by the power of the tribulation. However, his own concept of existence had only endured a small impact from the tribulation's concept of existence. In the past, such a small impact was indeed enough to completely shatter his concept of existence and make him lose all traces of his existence. However, that was only the past. For the current him, This kind of impact wasn't even enough to make him feel uncomfortable, as expected. The backlash is coming. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he felt the impact of the huge concept. Then, seizing the opportunity, he displayed all kinds of concept-related techniques that he had comprehended in the past billions of years, allowing his own concept of existence to cut into the huge concept with a method that was billions of times more precise than a scalpel. All kinds of mysterious quakes erupted in his concept of existence, causing cracks and fragments to appear in the huge concept in the process. As a result, the huge concept kept splattering everywhere. When such changes were reflected in the real world, they caused the power of the tribulation to continuously dissipate, causing the power of the tribulation to gradually weaken. However, because it was a change on the level of concept, even the will of heaven and earth couldn't detect this at all. Although it vaguely felt that something was happening, it vaguely discovered that. It seemed to have overlooked some important information, but it couldn't find out what it was no matter how hard it tried. It only knew that the crisis of its life and death was getting closer and closer. This situation made the will of heaven and earth, which had some characteristics of a living being's will, begin to fear and become irritated. At this time, its emotions went berserk, causing the entire world to become more and more chaotic. Boundless chaotic energy swept and swept through the entire world. It was as if it was plowing the ground, stirring up the world over and over again countless times. After this stirring up, the damage to Luo Fan's body. Naturally, it didn't happen at all. Instead, it caused this world to become chaotic, as if it had returned to a state of chaos. Although this world was barren and broken back then, there were still bits and pieces of vitality. However, one could still see bits and pieces of vitality. One could still see that it was once a place with infinite vitality. If this world had a prosperous history, then now all of it had completely disappeared. No matter which level this world went into, there was no longer any trace of the existence of any living beings. Not to mention the various natural sceneries. Even the heavens and the earth were changing and changing at any moment. The tribulations themselves were existences that possessed powerful instincts. In fact, once one's strength reached the level of innate Grand Luo, one would naturally develop their own intelligence and transform into a different kind of living being if there were no restrictions placed upon them. The might of this tribulation was countless trillions of times more formidable than the natural immortal realm. Even though it was still restricted by the chaotic state, merely the various things outside of the restrictions were sufficient to allow it to develop sufficient intelligence and possess sufficiently formidable instincts. Such intelligence was close to the intelligence of the world's will. Therefore, it wasn't something that living beings could understand, and the various things it displayed were completely different from living beings. However, its instincts weren't much different from living beings. Such instincts had an indescribable fear towards death and an immeasurably urgent desire towards existence. With that being the case, its own concept of existence was being continuously attacked and destroyed by Luo Fan on the conceptual level, which naturally triggered its instincts and caused its potential to burst out. Under that burst of potential, the power of the tribulation brazenly broke through the difference between reality and the conceptual level and charged into the conceptual level. In that instant, the entire conceptual level surged without stopping. Like a huge rock being thrown into a calm lake, ripples after ripples began to spread in all directions from where the power rushed in. Countless concepts were completely destroyed by the impact. Everything it corresponded to was completely wiped out at the same time, and not a single trace was left in the hearts of all living beings and wills, as if it had never existed in the first place. It's here. At that moment, Luo Fan also noticed the existence of that will, and a thought flashed through his mind. Although it wasn't part of his plans for the power to appear here, nor did he predict that it would definitely appear here. However, in reality, if one were to think about it, one would know that its appearance was completely reasonable. After all, this was the third great calamity targeting him. How could there be no opponents at the final moment of such a great calamity? Even under the guidance of his own existence, the power of the tribulation would definitely cross the boundary and charge into the conceptual level to resist him. Although the way it appeared was unexpected, it was also reasonable. The place where the power appeared was around the huge concept, and it completely enveloped the huge concept. In other words, after it appeared, while it messed up the entire conceptual level, it also enveloped Luo Fan's concept of existence. In the blink of an eye, the endless crushing and repulsive force acted on Luo Fan's concept of existence, which had already turned into a sphere of light. It caused the impact, weakening, and crushing of the huge concept of existence to become 100 times more difficult. Faintly, it felt like it was difficult to move an inch forward, and the continuous depletion of the huge concept naturally slowed down, and it seemed like it was about to stop. Chapter 1942. An indescribable fluctuation began to emanate from his concept of existence. Along with this fluctuation, all the surrounding concepts were mobilized. All kinds of indescribable impacts erupted from these concepts and rushed towards the terrifying power that appeared around these concepts at this moment. This kind of control over other concepts on the concept level was something he had never possessed in the past. It was only after comprehending the concept level for such a long time and having such a deep understanding of the concept level that he could barely achieve this. However, that was just pushing the trend of these concepts. If he wanted to reverse the trend of these concepts, with his current understanding of the concept level, it was still extremely insufficient. Of course, this was already enough at this moment. For this concept level, all existences that did not belong to this concept level would be rejected by all the concepts within it. The power that came from the tribulations naturally belonged to the scope of its rejection. The reason why it did not show any rejection before was because the previous power was too powerful, and its essence was too high. Now, with Luo Fan's push, its rejection of that power erupted at the same time, and the resulting effect was terrifying enough to shake heaven and earth. In the blink of an eye, the power that belonged to the tribulations had produced an endless explosion. During this explosion, more and more power could not be maintained on this concept level, and it was brazenly knocked down and returned to the real world. In this way, the originally extremely tight encirclement of that huge concept became like a sieve at this moment. The obstruction and suppression of Luo Fan's concept of existence was naturally equivalent to no longer existing. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's heart suddenly relaxed. Although he had enough confidence in the power of the tribulations before, that was, after all, the power of the tribulations. The pressure it brought him was still unparalleled, after all. He could not truly relax completely. Now, he discovered that the power of the tribulations had turned into a sieve under his control, and the threat it posed to him had almost completely disappeared. Only then did he truly confirm what he had faintly known before, and his heart naturally relaxed because of this. As he relaxed, his intellect became extremely lively. Countless kinds of inspiration to resist that power and the huge concept were stimulated in his heart. In an instant, his concept of existence began to change. It was as if some kind of human-shaped shadow was casting all kinds of magical powers inside the concept of existence. All kinds of attacks aimed at the concept of existence burst out from the spherical concept of existence, covering the sky and earth as they pounced on the huge concept of existence. During this process, the power of the tribulation naturally reacted, and all sorts of profound changes appeared within it. Illusory images of different worlds and concepts were constantly being born from the power of tribulations. Even the massive concept itself began to transform along with the changes in this power, splitting into wisps of power. Bits and pieces of wonderful concepts blocked all kinds of terrifying attacks derived from Luo Fan's concept of existence. Luo Fan, who could directly control the concept of existence to attack, did not care about such a crude defense at all. Each of the attacks from his concept of existence bypassed the resistance of the power, and the shielding of the giant concept in a miraculous way. It was as if a knife had sliced off a piece of meat on that huge concept, causing that huge concept to crumble, bit by bit. At the same time, the power of the tribulation was still withstanding the crazy rejection of the surrounding concepts. However, the essence of the remnant power was relatively high, and its resistance to the rejection of the concept was relatively strong, so it had been difficult to see any effect. Only at this moment, when Luo Fan's concept of existence attacked, causing a huge impact on that huge force and causing astonishing damage to that huge concept itself, the foundation of that force's existence was shaken. Finally, it could no longer maintain its conceptual level and was expelled by that repulsive force at a speed that was 10 times or even 100 times faster than before. It fell to the level of reality and disappeared from the conceptual level. As a result, a vicious cycle was formed. The power of the tribulation couldn't withstand the impact of Luo Fan's concept of existence. So the resistance of the power of the tribulation against the repulsive power was weakened, causing more of the tribulation's power to be expelled out of the concept. This caused the resistance of the huge concept to weaken, causing the impact of Luo Fan's concept of existence to weaken the huge concept more and more easily, and also more and more quickly. And this, once again, started the cycle from just now. And just like that, the cycle would repeat again and again, never to be broken. This process continued to develop. After an unknown amount of time, all the power of the tribulation no longer remained on the plane of concept. All the power had been knocked down and returned to reality. The huge concept had also been reduced to less than 1/10,000th of its original size. Compared to Luo Fan's concept of existence, this was still about 100 times larger. Looking at the huge concept in front of him, Luo Fan faintly felt an indescribable sense of danger. Being weakened to this extent was undoubtedly a great success. It meant that he had gained the absolute upper hand in the battle against the third Great Tribulation. But at the same time, it also meant that he had reached the most dangerous moment, because it meant that the tribulation was very likely to erupt with a final attack that would take him down with it, just like the other Luo Fan back then. Thinking back to the artificial, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light that the other Luo Fan had created at the last moment, one could imagine how terrifying and unbelievable the final attack this tribulation, which was much stronger than the other Luo Fan, would be in its final frenzy. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his vigilance to its peak. He was constantly attacking. While constantly weakening the existence of the tribulation, he also left a part of his mind to be on guard against any possible attacks that might erupt from the tribulation. The kind of terrifying attack that could turn the tables. Just as he was on guard, time passed again. After an unknown period of time, it even made Luo Fan feel that his vigilance was a little unnecessary. The power of the tribulation didn't change much. Just as it was about to completely sink, a change occurred. The existence of the tribulation, which had been weakened by half and seemed to be only about 40 to 50 times larger than Luo Fan's concept of existence, suddenly froze. Then, the concept began to shrink. It began to shrink abruptly, as if an incomparably huge black hole had suddenly appeared in the deepest part of it. Not good. Facing this situation, Luo Fan knew that things were not good. He hurriedly controlled his concept of existence and began to retreat. At the same time, with his understanding of concepts, he guided the endless concepts around him to gather in front of him, constantly blocking himself and the existence of the tribulation. It wasn't that he didn't want to use more active methods to resist the existence of the tribulation, but because his current offensive had already reached his limit. That was to say, with his current understanding of the concepts, it was impossible for him to understand them. With his control over his own concept of existence, the strongest attack he could unleash was only at the level that he had unleashed during the long period of time just now. When he realized that the tribulation might be desperate, he had already unleashed his strongest attack and launched it at the huge concept. Under such circumstances, the only thing he could do was, of course, to protect himself first and free himself from the counterattack of the existence of the tribulation. Just as he arranged tens of thousands of concepts in front of him, when he formed a shield, the existence of the tribulation had shrunk to the size of a small dot. That small dot, it couldn't even be seen. It felt like a small dot of a concept. It appeared where the existence of the tribulation originally was. It suddenly paused. Then an earth-shattering explosion erupted from that small dot. However, this explosion wasn't like the explosion of a bomb, but it happened in an extremely mysterious way. It had only produced a huge shock wave. That's all. The small dot itself didn't collapse because of this, nor was it destroyed because of this. That huge shock wave was constantly unleashed at this time, producing an indescribably terrifying impact. In that impact, the countless concepts that Luo Fan had arranged in front of his own concept suffered a huge blow. Countless concepts collapsed under this impact, completely turning into nothingness and vanishing into nothingness. However, after all, with the shield blocking it, although Luo Fan felt the existence of the impact because it had been weakened layer by layer, he didn't suffer any damage because of it. However, in the face of this situation, Luo Fan was even more shocked. He retreated even faster and used an even stronger will to summon other concepts to pile up in front of him to make up for the shield formed by the concept. He felt an extremely strong sense of danger. If he didn't do this, his life would be in an extremely severe crisis. The source of all the changes in that small that was none other than compressing most of the explosive power inside in order to brew an even more violent change. At this time, Luo Fan's actions had just produced a slight effect, summoning a considerable part of the twisting force in front of him to make up for the huge shield. At this time, the change brewed by the compression of most of the explosive force inside the small had finally been stimulated. A ball of flame appeared above that small dot. This kind of flame also belonged to the concept level. In other words, it was a concept of absolute combustion. The appearance of this concept of absolute combustion immediately ignited the small dot itself, completely transforming the concept of the existence of the catastrophe into this concept of absolute combustion. At this moment, it could be said that Luo Fan's third great tribulation had been passed, as long as he could survive under this concept of absolute combustion. After all, after completely transforming into this concept of absolute combustion, the concept of the existence of the third catastrophe no longer existed. In other words, the third tribulation had already disappeared, and this meant that Luo Fan had already endured the third great calamity. However, facing the fact that he had passed the third catastrophe, at this time, Luo Fan only felt an indescribable bitterness in his heart, because he had no confidence in resisting this concept of absolute combustion. After completely devouring and igniting the concept of the existence of the catastrophe, the flame had already expanded tens of thousands of times, from the original bean-like flame to a huge torch. And then it began to turn the surrounding concepts into more and more concepts. Or as fuel, it continued to devour them, causing its torch-like appearance to gradually expand. During this process, many concepts around it disappeared and were continuously devoured, causing the place to gradually turn into a huge bonfire. Then, from the bonfire, a huge pile of flames appeared. It turned into a large sea of fire, constantly rushing towards Luo Fan's concept of existence. At this time, Luo Fan regretted it again, and rejoiced. He regretted and rejoiced for the same goal, which was to summon so many concepts in front of him to form a shield. The reason why he regretted this was very simple, because these shields were also composed of concepts. Their existence was a large amount of fuel for the concept of absolute combustion, which could continuously strengthen the concept of absolute combustion. It would become stronger and more terrifying. And the reason why he felt rejoiced, the reason was not complicated, because if these concepts did not serve as a shield, then what became the fuel would become his own concept of existence. Due to this complicated mentality, He quickly retreated, constantly distancing himself from the concept of absolute combustion. At this conceptual level, there must be a concept that targets this concept of absolute combustion. Although it was the first time he had seen this concept of absolute combustion, Luo Fan was extremely certain of this. It was not difficult to speculate. After all, although this concept of absolute combustion was condensed by the power of the calamity by sacrificing itself, since it could appear, it meant that this concept of absolute combustion itself existed at the conceptual level. Endless concepts naturally had endless possibilities. Any concept that could be created by any person or existence must have appeared before. And since this concept of absolute combustion that could ignite all concepts had appeared before, and this conceptual level still existed and was still flourishing with such endless concepts, wouldn't it be natural for there to be some concept that could curb this concept of absolute combustion? After understanding that the concept of absolute combustion must have a concept of restraining it, he naturally knew what he had to do. For him, as long as he persisted long enough for the concept to restrain the concept of absolute combustion to appear and restrain it, then he would be considered to have truly survived this catastrophe. He would truly escape with his life. With this guiding ideology, Luo Fan tried his best to urge his concept of existence to run in the direction of the concept of absolute combustion. Perhaps due to the urging of the life and death crisis, the speed at which he controlled the concept of existence was now at least 10 times faster than when he thought of moving the huge concept over. Moreover, the speed was still constantly accelerating during the process. Such a change made the concept of absolute combustion closely follow his concept of existence, as if it had already licked it, but in the end, it still could not really come into contact with his concept of existence. It was always that little bit away from reaching its goal. As for everything that was happening behind him, Luo Fan was very clear. Every time the concept of absolute combustion approached him, it made him break out in a cold sweat. Under the urging of the ever-approaching crisis of death, he controlled his concept of existence to move faster and faster. In fact, while the speed was increasing, the form of the concept of existence itself was also gradually changing. The halo that was originally around the sphere began to converge with all its might, trying its best to draw closer to the sphere itself. Get closer. In the end, the halo seemed to have turned into a thin layer of gauze that enveloped the sphere, causing it to shrink to the point where it could no longer shrink. This was the greatest possibility of reducing its volume, and the greatest possibility of avoiding the possibility of being engulfed and ignited by the concept of absolute combustion. Unknowingly, the entire concept had turned into a boundless sea of fire. The concept of absolute combustion had practically engulfed and transformed everything within the range of Luo Fan's senses into the concept of absolute combustion. The movement speed of Luo Fan's concept of existence was already extremely fast. However, its base speed was still too low. Even though he struggled with great difficulty for a few days, in the end, he still couldn't avoid the fate of being engulfed by the concept of absolute combustion. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan felt boundless heat and pain gushing out from his concept of existence. All of his senses had already transformed into boundless flames. Chapter 1943. At this moment, the despair of death emerged from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. At this moment, the structure of his concept of existence began to shake violently, then began to collapse bit by bit. Traces of his concept of existence were constantly ignited, transformed into the concept of absolute combustion, and merged with the endless absolute combustion around him. Fortunately, after his concept of existence was enhanced by this worldview, he was no longer the same as before. But at this moment, even though his concept of existence was so damaged and quickly transformed into the concept of absolute combustion, his spiritual consciousness still existed, and it wasn't affected much. At this moment, he could still clearly sense everything, including the bit of clarity in his body that was gradually being ignited and replaced. Everything was within his perception. At this moment, he could only persist in this thought. As his concept of existence was constantly being ignited and devoured, he could only struggle and resist with all his might to slow down the speed at which he was completely ignited and replaced. Although it was impossible for him to resist the concept of absolute combustion, after all, he had a rather deep understanding of the concept level, and in the end, he was still able to barely slow it down. His spiritual consciousness still existed, and his perception was still clear. This didn't seem to be a good thing at this moment. At this moment, the horror of his concept of existence being ignited and the endless pain it brought were transmitted into his heart bit by bit. Every trace and every inch was completely accepted by him. If it was an ordinary cultivator, the moment they came into contact with this feeling, they would have collapsed, and their concept of existence would have been completely destroyed. Such pain was self-evident. It went without saying how unbearable it was, but Luo Fan could only bear it without holding anything back. That feeling. Needless to say, after an unknown amount of time, when Luo Fan's own concept of existence was only left with the last trace, it seemed that it was about to completely disappear and be completely destroyed. Suddenly, the boundless concept of absolute combustion suddenly paused. It was as if time had suddenly stopped. Of course, there was no concept of time in this concept level, so this kind of pause was more subtle, more complicated, and more difficult to describe than ordinary time pauses. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He felt an indescribable sense of hope. It came from the bottom of his heart. Following his thoughts, the concept of absolute combustion began to transform again, transforming everything that it had devoured bit by bit and returning to its original position. The first to bear the brunt was obviously the concept of Luo Fan's existence. During this transformation, he felt an indescribably wonderful feeling. It was as if he was in the most beautiful place in the universe. It was the most wonderful state. Every minute, every second, every moment, he felt that he was growing. They all felt that they were becoming complete, becoming perfect. Immersed in this wonderful feeling, he once again forgot the passage of time. After an unknown period of time, a sense of completion surged into his mind. Then, he felt an indescribable sense of freedom, unfettered, and perfection surging up. Every sensation he felt was unprecedentedly beautiful. With this change, Luo Fan completely came back to his senses. He looked at the conceptual level and found that the sea of fire was rapidly retreating and shrinking. Although, during this process, the sea of fire had been transformed back to its original concept. However, after the sea of fire shrank, the surrounding scene still did not return to its original appearance. Instead, it became extremely distorted, like an abstract painting. The original appearance could not be found at all. Sure enough, without the support of the worldview, one can't maintain oneself in the end. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan came to a realization. The reason why these concepts that had been transformed by the concept of absolute combustion couldn't return to their original appearance was because the main body of those concepts didn't have enough strength to maintain themselves. In the process of being transformed by the concept of absolute combustion, their bodies had completely collapsed because they couldn't withstand this transformation. Now, even if they were transformed back by some incomparably mysterious conceptual mechanism, the lost self had already disappeared. No matter what, they couldn't return in the end. Because of this, such a situation was created. While he was thinking, the sea of fire had already converged back to its original mung bean-like state, just like when it first appeared. At this time, Luo Fan raised his vigilance. Next, if the concept of absolute combustion turned back to its original form, then it would turn back into the concept of existence of tribulations. If that was the case, wouldn't it mean that his third tribulations had returned? How could he not care about this situation? Although he knew that the probability of this happening was rather slim, there was still a certain possibility of it happening. At this moment, the concept of absolute combustion trembled slightly and degenerated once again, turning into a similarly extremely distorted concept. Looking at the size of the concept, and then looking at its distorted posture, Luo Fan knew that he could be completely at ease. Looks like I've survived this tribulation. Qin Wentian muttered to himself. With this thought in mind, he suddenly felt a strong suction force acting directly on his body, pulling him. With a slight jolt, he had already left the conceptual level. At the same time, in the absolutely distorted heaven and earth, a figure appeared out of nowhere. This figure was clearly Luo Fan's appearance. Previously, after Luo Fan's body was destroyed, he was only left with a conceptual existence. Although his body still existed, he did not have a body. Now that he had been pulled out of the concept plane and his body had reappeared, it was clear that he needed to condense his body again and become the carrier of his concept of existence. That was the reason for the current situation. The concept of existence did not suffer any damage. On the contrary, it became unprecedentedly stable. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, it was naturally an extremely easy task to condense a new body. In the blink of an eye, that body, he had completely appeared in this distorted world. As he appeared, everything in his body that was originally dependent on his concept of existence also returned and appeared in his body. Among them was his innate, inextinguishable spirit light. Everything within the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light was contained within. I've finally fully recovered. Sensing everything in his body, Luo Fan sighed with emotion. He could not hide the relief on his face. In that instant, the entire distorted world began to collapse. It was originally just a distortion, but in just a short moment, it had completely turned into fragments that began to surge around his body like smoke. An indescribably terrifying impact force was released from the surrounding world and started to destroy everything that originally existed in this world. This included Luo Fan. However, this kind of destruction couldn't even get close to Luo Fan at this time. At the moment when it was about to pounce on him, the power had already dissipated by itself, as if it had never appeared at all. After all, this was a world with distorted concepts. This kind of world was already extremely fragile, so the power that it produced was naturally also extremely fragile. When faced with Luo Fan's concept of existence, it naturally could not produce any effects. In the blink of an eye, it had completely collapsed and could no longer produce any effects. This could only happen in a distorted world that had no self. If it was in any other normal world, it would be impossible. If it was in other normal worlds, even if it was just an ordinary power, even if it could not harm Luo Fan, it would not collapse and dissipate so easily. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an indifferent expression on his face. His heart was filled with an indescribable joy. There was also an indescribable joy in his eyes. Unknowingly, the smoke that was formed by the surrounding fragments of the world started to gradually dissipate and turn into nothing. He reappeared in a world that he was extremely familiar with. That world was colliding with another world, a world that was essentially a fragment formed after the collapse of the Great World. His perception of the strange power that could bring him between different perfect worlds and the Earth universe had been completely restored at this moment. Faced with this situation, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already completely passed the third tribulation? He was already one step closer to the supreme realm of true divine. With a slight jolt in his heart, he already knew how much time had passed in the outside world when he was in the third tribulation. It's only 100 years. After understanding everything, he could not help but smile. In fact, even if he had spent hundreds of thousands of years in the normal world, he had already spent hundreds of millions of years in the conceptual level. However, in reality, only less than 100 years had passed. It was so much so that even though the collision between the two worlds had already entered the middle phase, with a small portion of one world being devoured by the other, the true clash still hadn't arrived. At this moment, when he raised his head to look at the sky, the starry sky of the other world seemed to be hanging above his head and was pressing down on him, producing an indescribable deterrent force. Looking at the entire world, it had already become unprecedentedly barren. Even the creatures formed by the will of the world in the past no longer existed. It was as if they didn't exist at all. Clearly, the will of the world in this world had been completely destroyed in Luo Fan's third tribulation. But now, there were no longer any traces of its existence in this world. With a slight jolt in his heart, waves of law power began to surge out from Luo Fan's worldview of laws. They quickly filled up his body and replaced the endless power in his body with a posture that transcended time. With this change, his body gradually emitted a terrifying aura that shook the world. Under that aura, the world, which was already on the verge of collapse and was being torn apart by the other world, finally couldn't take it anymore. With him at the center, countless cracks started to spread in all directions, covering the entire world at an incomparably fast speed. During this process, the entire world seemed to be wrapped by a spider web that was getting bigger and thicker. The laws of this world also began to become chaotic during this process. Although the various original natures were different, they could still maintain a balance under the moderation of other laws. The laws that maintained stability and did not collide with each other completely lost their restraints and restrictions. They began to collide and kill each other without any reservations. The impact of this was all the laws began to riot. The four fundamental existences of this world pushed towards the chaotic abyss at an incomparably fast speed. The cracks that had already spread to the entire world suddenly seemed to have been pushed forward thousands of times. In a much shorter time than before, they quickly enveloped the entire world. Moreover, the chaos caused by the laws caused by Luo Fan's aura also spread to every inch of space-time in this world. In an instant, this world completely collapsed. At this moment, a strong sense of life and death crisis suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. For him, who had just escaped from the third tribulation, the feeling of dealing with a life and death crisis was too familiar. Instinctively, he had already stimulated the strange power in his body. An indescribable suction acted on his body. In a flash, his figure had already become blurry. Then, the world completely collapsed. When this place was about to be completely engulfed by the chaotic state, his figure had already brazenly disappeared amidst the boundless chaos. When he reappeared, he was already inside the mysterious energy. In other words, he was at the center of the mysterious energy. He had rushed to a platform in the boundless void. When he raised his head and looked in front of him, the two worlds that were originally colliding had already become a world that was wrapped in a layer of fog. That fog was none other than the countless fragments that had formed when the world that Luo Fan was in had collapsed. In other words, every speck of fog was an extremely large number of fragments. At this moment, the world that Empty Lady and the others were in seemed to have transformed into a vortex that began to continuously absorb the surrounding fog, causing it to continuously rush into that world. Every time a speck of fog rushed in, it would cause a flash of light in that part of the world, as if there was a huge explosion. Just like that, the dense fog continued to rush into it, and the light seemed to be endless. It was as if the light was always bright, and the sky and earth had turned from a planet into a huge sun. It seems that world no longer needs my help. When Luo Fan saw this scene, he knew in his heart that there was no longer any suspense in the outcome of this collision. At this moment, the countless fragments of the world that had crashed into that world was indeed a disaster for the living beings in that world and the resistance force within it. This was because every bit of the fragment was like a planet that had smashed into that world. Now, the number of the fragments of the world that had turned into the surging fog that had enveloped the world was simply indescribable with trillions of words. Under such circumstances, it was equivalent to them having to deal with targets that had terrifying power and shocking destructive power, but were not too numerous. Now, they had to deal with targets that were much less powerful and destructive, but had a much greater number of targets. The number of targets had increased by countless times. If this reduction in power was satisfactory, such as reducing it to the point where it did not pose much of a threat to those living beings, it would naturally be a good thing for them. However, even if the fragments of the world had become even more fragmented and their power had decreased, it was still extremely powerful for living beings. It still exceeded the range of what they could bear, and they needed the combined strength of many living beings to be able to resist one of them. Under such circumstances, this change was clearly a disaster that was enough to make people despair. Under such circumstances, such a change was clearly a disaster that could make all living beings despair. For that world itself, the situation was already different. To the heaven and earth of the other world, the only thing that posed a threat was its size. Because there was not much difference in their sizes, the result of the collision could be the collapse and destruction of the other world, or it could also be the collapse and destruction of this world. Even if there was a difference in the probability of the two happening, it was not small. But now, the side that collided completely collapsed and turned into countless fragments. This obviously meant that the result was already fixed. In this way, for that world, the possibility of itself collapsing and being destroyed was naturally gone. Was this not a good thing? Knowing that the result was already set, Luo Fan also gave up on the idea of going to that world to help. He directly sat cross-legged on the platform and began to carefully consolidate the various improvements that he had obtained after passing through the third Great Tribulation. Passing through the third Great Tribulation was indeed an extremely painful experience for him, causing him to suffer endless pain that he had not even imagined in the past. However, at the same time, it was also a huge opportunity for him, allowing him to make progress that he did not even dare to imagine before. Chapter 1944. All sorts of indescribable feelings surfaced in Luo Fan's heart. In a trance, the world that he had experienced had unknowingly appeared in his heart. The primordial world, the great Tianyuan world, the Earth universe, and the place he had entered through the Earth universe were initially incomplete. However, with his help, it had become complete and perfect. At this moment, they all appeared in his heart. All sorts of things that had happened to his main body in the primordial world and his clone in the great Tianyuan world emerged in his heart without reservation. In the primordial world, Luo Fan had even taken ancestor Hong Jun as his disciple. In that world, he was definitely an invincible existence. Although he had already split into his main body and clone, both of them were still Luo Fan. Their wills were completely the same. Originally, even though the two of them were separated by the boundless chaos, they could still continuously communicate and balance their realms. At this moment, after his cultivation realm had increased, the two of them were finally connected without reservation. However, in an instant, all aspects were reunited. All the gains that the clone had obtained in the Earth universe and other worlds for billions of trillions of years were fed back to the true body at the same time. In an instant, the cultivation realm of the true body advanced layer by layer. All the Dharma power and power in the body began to rapidly transform into the Dharma power of law. At this moment, the entire primordial world began to tremble slightly. Luo Fan's clone had been in the Earth's universe for hundreds of millions of years. In terms of the time that he had experienced, it had been billions of trillions of years. However, to the primordial world, his main body had only lived for 1,000,000 years. Compared to the newly born primordial world, 1,000,000 years was indeed not a short period of time. However, if it was used for cultivation, this time, obviously, it was far from enough. At the very least, all along, Luo Fan's main body did not have too many gains. All of the increase in his cultivation realm and all of his comprehension toward cultivation were obtained by synchronizing with his clone and communicating with it. This might be a little embarrassing for his main body. However, as a whole, he tried his best to reduce the Tao realm and the main body's cultivation conflicts, making it so that the cultivation of the clone could be the easiest. The smoothest thing was that it was fed back to the main body, allowing the main body's cultivation realm to rise smoothly like never before. Now, Luo Fan's main body was in the eyes of all living beings in the primordial world. He would be a saint through and through. It should be known that the primordial world had been born for such a long time, and even the primordial chi had not completely degenerated into the essence of the world. There were even remnants of the chaotic chi in some places. The cultivation level of all living beings was at most at the primordial zenith heaven realm. Even Hong Jun had only gone a little deeper in this realm. Under such a background, Luo Fan, who far surpassed the innate grand Luo realm, even surpassed the quasi-saint realm, the false saint realm, the false saint realm, the supreme monarch realm, and so on, was simply like a giant suddenly appearing in an ant's nest. In the eyes of the ants, wasn't the power of this giant absolute, invincible, and unshakable? In terms of status, the current Luo Fan was even higher than the legendary Hong Jun in the primordial world. Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the void. Billions of rays of light radiated from his body and penetrated the entire boundless world. It was as if there was an additional sun in the sky of this world. With a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. A palace appeared in his hand. This was none other than the Void Wuji Palace that he had refined from the very beginning. After his Dao realm had risen again and again, after he had refined the Void Wuji Palace again and again, the palace had not only perfectly realized the structure that he had designed, but it had also reached a state where he could absolutely do as he pleased. In other words, no matter what the Void Wuji Palace was like in the past, whether it was integrated into the world or integrated into himself or existed alone, he could now change it and change it at will. Just like at this moment, he completely plucked it out and placed it in his hand. Looking at the everlasting Void Palace, he suddenly smiled and clasped his hands together. A boundless and terrifying might was released from his hands, brazenly pressing down on the limitless Void Palace. As the boundless and terrifying power pressed down, the Void Wuji Palace suddenly collapsed. Endless worlds shot out from it and splashed in all directions. This change directly caused the entire primordial world to shake violently. Endless thunder and endless roars were transmitted from the places where the worlds passed by, covering the entire world and all living beings. For a moment, countless living beings were trembling in fear and panic. Only Luo, Fu, and the others, who had a close relationship with Luo Fan, could feel the familiar aura. An indescribable joy surged in their hearts. At this time, what Luo Fan wanted to do was to completely integrate the limitless Void Palace into the world, turning it into an extremely special group of worlds in the world. It should be known that after the Void Wuji Palace was opened up layer by layer, it had already become a minor kiliacosm, a medium kiliacosm, and a major kiliacosm. In addition, the speed of the flow of time was different. Whether it was the scale or the wonder, it had already far exceeded the imagination of all living beings. Such an existence integrated into the primordial world and fed back to the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. It could definitely add all kinds of indescribable mysteries to the supreme great Tao. It caused the entire primordial world to become more and more profound. It was even enough to change the growth direction of the entire world. Of course, this kind of situation could only appear at the beginning of the world, even if the primordial world had already passed through two great tribulations. Compared to other perfect worlds, they could no longer be considered novices in terms of tribulation transcendence level. However, looking at the time, they could only be calculated in millions of years. Compared to other perfect worlds that could easily take billions or trillions of years, this was not the beginning of the world. What was the beginning of the world? Things. However, it was almost completely according to Luo Fan's plan. The endless worlds in the Void Wuji Palace continued to integrate into the primordial world. They merged with the laws of the world itself and interacted with the supreme great Tao of the world. Not only did they change the supreme great Tao of the world, but they also changed the worlds themselves. Then, the endless minor kiliacosm, medium kiliacosm, major kiliacosm, and even a world that was brewing above these levels, which was between the major kiliacosm and the perfect world. As they gradually integrated into the world, they gradually became an inseparable part of the world. A brand new balance that combined the primordial world began to be established between the many worlds. With this balance, just as Luo Fan had expected, the supreme great Tao gave birth to all kinds of indescribable mysteries. The speed at which the connate essence energy of the entire world degenerated was as if there was a propeller, and it kept accelerating. In the past, before he returned to the Earth universe, Luo Fan thought that the connate essence energy transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was a kind of degeneration. It was just like the chaotic essence energy transforming into the connate essence energy. However, after experiencing so many things and seeing so many worlds, he gradually understood that although this kind of change was a kind of degeneration and a reduction in energy level for the essence energy itself, it was a kind of progress for the world and all living beings in it. In other words, the evolution of the connate essence energy into the heaven and earth essence energy basically meant that the world was growing. The reason was very simple. It was because the connate essence energy was not something else. It was the foundation of any world. If the yuan qi in a part of the world was always connate yuan qi, then it meant that the foundation of that part of the world was constantly being released and being consumed at all times. In this way, how could the world improve? How could it grow? For living beings, the essence energy in the world was the connate essence energy. Although it could give them a lot of benefits in a short period of time, allowing them to obtain longevity without cultivating. However, this was consuming the foundation of the world. To obtain longevity in such a way and absorb such essence energy to increase one's cultivation was a sin against the heavens. Perhaps one could increase one's cultivation at an extremely fast speed in a short period of time. However, in the long run, one would become more and more unlucky, and the opportunities one encountered would become fewer and fewer. In the end, when this kind of bad luck developed to an extreme, one might even choke to death from drinking a mouthful of water. However, once the essence energy in any world was transformed into the heaven and earth essence energy, the situation would obviously be different. Compared to the connate essence energy, the heaven and earth essence energy was acquired, but it was a renewable resource for the world. No matter how much the heaven and earth essence energy was consumed, it would not damage the foundation of the world. On the contrary, the greater the consumption of the heaven and earth essence energy, it could even accelerate the energy circulation of the world, causing the world to circulate more smoothly. This would instead bring about considerable benefits to the world. In this way, if a cultivator absorbed the heaven and earth essence energy to cultivate, although it might not make his luck better, he would not become more unlucky. This was obviously a huge benefit. In this way, the connate essence energy transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was clearly beneficial to both the world and living beings. This was, of course, a form of growth. Currently, the speed at which the connate essence energy in the primordial world was transforming into the heaven and earth essence energy was accelerating. This clearly meant that the growth of the primordial world was accelerating. This was also in line with Luo Fan's previous expectations. The acceleration of the growth of the world also brought about a result that was unknown whether it was good or bad. That was, the arrival of the third great tribulation of the primordial world had begun to rapidly advance. Before Luo Fan merged the limitless void palace into the primordial world, it would still be billions of years before the third great tribulation of the primordial world. There is still a lot of time for all living beings to grow and for the will of the world to continue brewing. However, as Luo Fan completely merged the limitless void palace into the world, the time for the third great tribulation of the world to descend had already been advanced from the original billions of years to millions of years. Although Luo Fan did not expect such a situation, he appeared rather calm. The primordial world. After all, it was a world that had developed normally. It was a great tribulation of the world. In fact, compared to the tribulation of heaven and earth that he had created, it was much weaker. Compared to the tribulation of earth and the universe, the tribulation of heaven and earth in that imperfect world, it was much weaker. To Luo Fan, who had already passed the third great tribulation, this level of great tribulation of the world obviously did not cause much pressure. Not to mention that he still had millions of years to prepare. Even if it appeared now, he was confident that he could survive it. There were millions of worlds in the limitless void palace. If he wanted to fuse all of them into the world, he would have to do so. It was obviously a huge project. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he wanted to complete it and make all the worlds merge into the world, it would still take quite a long time. This process, it lasted for a whole year. After a year, Luo Fan completely merged the last world into the primordial world. The countless worlds in the limitless void palace re-established a complete system in the outside world, forming a strange group of worlds in the primordial world. I finally succeeded. Seeing that the group of worlds had begun to be established, the time flow of the layers of worlds began to stack up again. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this change, a connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that had been brewing for millions of years suddenly shrank and turned into a ball. It began to inexplicably resonate with the outside world. Compared to his split body, Luo Fan's original body was attached to the primordial world, which had just been formed. The opportunity was obviously more powerful. Back then, his clone had worked hard and even spent who knew how many hundreds of millions of years to barely take possession of a strand of innate indestructible spirit light. He had left his mark on the innate indestructible spirit light. However, his original body had easily obtained two connate inextinguishable spiritual lights. Now, one of them had been integrated into his divine soul, waiting for his divine soul to refine it and give its connate inextinguishable spiritual light to his own divine soul. As for the other one, although he had also placed it in his divine soul, he had let it evolve naturally. After endless time, it would turn into a real primordial origin spiritual treasure. This kind of luxury, compared to the bitterness of the split body, was like the difference between heaven and earth. If it were not for the fact that his original body and his split body shared the same will, perhaps Luo Fan's split body would have been jealous of his original body. And now, what was changing was the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that was evolving into a primordial origin spiritual treasure. At this moment, it was activating the evolution that had been brewing for millions of years and was transforming into a spiritual treasure embryo. As for why this kind of transformation happened at this moment, there were two reasons. Firstly, at this moment, he had already rejected all foreign objects other than the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. His body had become incomparably pure, and his fusion with the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light had become unprecedentedly deep. As a result, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light had become unprecedentedly active. Secondly, at this moment, he had helped the primordial world grow and even faintly change the direction of its growth. This caused the primordial world to instinctively get close to him. Therefore, it instinctively opened up a mysterious authority that was not open to him before. And this authority allowed the unprecedentedly active connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to absorb endless nutrients. Finally, it crossed that boundary and finally obtained this crucial transformation. From the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it transformed into a spiritual treasure embryo. This spiritual treasure embryo was completely different from the spiritual treasure embryo that his clone had obtained. The foundation of the split spirit treasure embryo wasn't indestructible. Although it was already a spirit treasure embryo and possessed the characteristics of indestructibility, it wasn't truly indestructible. Once the attack exceeded a certain limit, the spirit treasure embryo would eventually be destroyed. However, the spiritual treasure embryo of the main body was completely different. Because its foundation was the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it had the characteristics of indestructibility. Therefore, no matter how strong the attack was, it would at most be scattered and turned back into the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. This difference caused the safety of the two spiritual treasure embryos to be greatly different. While Luo Fan was thinking, the changes of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light continued. After the entire connate, inextinguishable spiritual light shrank into the shape of a ball, it began to shrink and tremble slightly, faintly resonating with the outside world. It was like a heartbeat but also like a huge living creature was breathing. And with this change, the image of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light also gradually changed. A thin veil of light appeared on the ball, and the ball itself seemed to be filled with endless mysteries, becoming indescribably complex and subtle. Vaguely, an aura that belonged to the world view gradually emerged from it. That's right, the image that the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light had evolved was the image of the worldview that had been condensed. Obviously, it had evolved completely according to the state of Luo Fan's body and mind, and according to the state of his worldview. This change lasted for 100 years before it finally stopped. Chapter 1945. As the spiritual treasure embryo was formed, the countless rays of light radiating from Luo Fan's body gradually disappeared. After a while, they turned invisible. The rays of light that had lasted for such a long time suddenly disappeared out of thin air in a day. This made the living beings in the untainted land unable to react for a while. After a while, they realized that the changes that had made them tremble with fear for such a long time had finally passed. For a moment, all living beings heaved a sigh of relief, and their expressions became relaxed. Is everything over? Somewhere in the world, Hong Jun, who was standing on the top of a mountain, had such a thought. Previously, all living beings were shocked by the various changes in the untainted land caused by Luo Fan, but they were just shocked. Very few living beings could comprehend anything from the changes. However, Hong Jun was Hong Jun after all. His talent and willpower were much stronger than all living beings. In this light, he could feel the source of all these changes. He could feel the innate spirit light that was leaking out from Luo Fan's body and the mysteries of the innate spirit light. Through the understanding of these various mysteries, he had unknowingly advanced into a cultivation realm. The mana in his body was broken again and again and again and again. During this process, the nature of the mana gradually changed and the essence of the mana gradually improved. In such a short period of time, he had already improved by many times and reached the peak of the innate zenith heaven. He was only a thin piece of paper away from the sage-to-be realm. Even the distance of this thin piece of paper was only left behind because he pursued perfection and wanted to use the most perfect method to become a sage-to-be. With such a huge gain, he was naturally extremely reluctant to part with the rays of light emitted from Luo Fan's body. At this moment, when he realized that the rays of light had disappeared, he naturally showed a look of disappointment on his face. Just as Hong Jun was feeling disappointed, a voice that he had been looking forward to suddenly echoed in his ears. Just as Hong Jun was feeling disappointed, a voice that he had been looking forward to suddenly echoed in his ears. "Come here." Hearing this, Hong Jun was overjoyed. He immediately bowed and responded. His figure turned into a long rainbow and soared into the sky. He quickly rushed toward the place where he felt the light was coming from. After so many years of development, the primordial world had become extremely prosperous in terms of vitality. The huge continents were filled with living beings, and a prosperous cultivation civilization had developed, giving birth to countless cultivators. If it was in the past, Hong Jun would fly. He would definitely try to hide himself and hide his movement light. But at this time, he was looking forward to meeting Luo Fan. How could he care about anything else? At this moment, he only wanted to increase his speed. He allowed the rainbow to linger behind him for a long time without dissipating. As a result, any living beings that looked up from the continents it passed by would see a long arc of light that lingered in the sky for a long time. It did not dissipate for a long time, as if a wondrous scene had suddenly appeared in the sky. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, there were also long arcs of light rising into the sky and gathering towards Luo Fan. If one were to look at these changes from a macroscopic perspective, one would see that there were streaks of rainbows that were like the ribs of umbrellas that were constantly converging toward a certain place from all over the world. These were none other than Luo Fan's disciples. Obviously, Hong Jun was not the only one who had heard these sounds just now. His other disciples had also heard these sounds. At this time, they were also anxiously rushing towards Luo Fan from all directions like Hongjun. Luo Fan was sitting in the middle of the world in the Void Wuji Palace. In the real world, his figure had completely disappeared, leaving only nothingness in place. Under him, there was a vast platform. Around the platform, there were specks of light, like stars in the starry sky, decorating the surroundings. Those were the minor kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and boundless kiliocosms. In terms of quantity, the number of these countless specks of light was not much less than the stars in the starry sky. Luo Fan had accepted a total of 6 disciples in this untainted world. Hongjun, Luo Fu, Guang Pu, Lin Tiannan, Guling, Lei Jiuxiao, and the 2 children of Luo Fu and Guang Pu. There were a total of 8 people. At this moment, the 8 of them gathered at Luo Fan's location from all over the world as fast as they could. This scene was simply a shocking change for all living beings in this world. After all, the 8 of them had accumulated a great reputation in this long period of time, and all of them had become great figures. They suddenly moved at the same time, and they looked so anxious and impatient. Anyone who saw this would suspect that something big had happened in this world, and they needed to deal with it at the same time. Among the 8 of them, even Lin Tiannan, who was the weakest, was already at the innate Grand Luo realm. It went without saying that they were able to travel at such a fast speed. Even though the untainted world was billions of light years wide, it could not stop their speed. In just a day, even Lei Jiuxiao, who was the furthest away, had already sensed where Luo Fan was and saw the empty void. Disciple Hongjun, Luo Fu, greets Master, Father, Grandfather. May Master live forever. They did not exchange pleasantries. After everyone arrived, they kowtowed in the void and shouted. They were not surprised that they did not see Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan was omnipotent in their hearts. He was elusive, so it was normal that they did not see him. Compared to that, it was strange to see him waiting here. At this moment, the void shook slightly. Then, it was as if 2 invisible arms were grabbing the void and pushing it apart, causing the void to split from the center. A group of worlds was revealed. There, they saw Luo Fan, whom they had missed for more than 1,000,000 years. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at them and smiled. He said, "Come, I have some enlightenment this time, so I want to talk about Tao with you." Hearing this, Hongjun and the others' eyes lit up. Every time they heard Luo Fan talk about Tao, they all gained a lot. They all had great gains. The reason why they were able to make such great progress in such a short period of time was because Luo Fan had explained the Tao to them so many times. Now, they heard that Luo Fan was going to talk about Tao with them again, and it seemed to be a very important Tao that even Luo Fan had to treat with caution. How could they not be excited? How could they not be happy? Yes, everyone shouted excitedly. At that moment, he directly sat in front of Luo Fan. In fact, there were many other disciples under Luo Fan's tutelage. For example, the 3 female innate gods and the 2 flood dragons that he had tricked into becoming the mountain-guarding divine beasts. However, because the content of what he was going to talk about this time was too important, he did not want to reveal it to them for the time being. Therefore, he did not summon them. That was the reason why only Hongjun and the other 7 people were here. This time, I want to talk to you about the principle of achieving the mixed Yuan Dao fruit. Luo Fan's first sentence stunned Hongjun and the others. Their expressions changed greatly because of this sentence. Their eyes became extremely solemn and serious. Previously, when I traveled the heavens, I saw countless cultivation systems and learned about countless Tao of cultivation. Now, I will tell you all about my various understandings. I hope that you can comprehend your own way to achieve Tao and become a true sage in the future. Luo Fan looked at the 8 of them and sighed. Among the 8 of them, Hongjun was the most likely to become a true sage. After all, if Hongjun did not transmigrate, he seemed to be the kind of existence that could become a true sage. Now that he had experienced his cultivation, Hongjun could only be stronger than before and not weaker than before. It could be said that as long as the method was correct, becoming a true sage was almost inevitable. After him, it was Luo Fu, Guang Pu, Luo Chunyang, and their families. After them, it was Lin Tiannan, Gu Ling, Lei Jiuxiao, and the others. It could even be said that they could be regarded as the crown prince's study companions. However, no matter what, since he had already accepted them as his disciples, he naturally had to be responsible for them. He naturally had to guide them on the path that he thought was the most correct and smoothest. At that moment, he calmed himself down and began to slowly explain to the 8 of them the various realms of cultivation and the importance of the worldview in becoming a true sage. This time, there were no extravagant flowers falling from the sky or golden lotuses surging out of the ground. There was only a faint, clear light emitted from his body and enveloped the entire group of worlds, isolating the entire group of world from the primordial world outside. No matter what happened or what sound was produced, it could not be leaked out. Under the cover of the clear light, Hong Jun and the others all felt indescribably clear. He remembered every word that Luo Fan spat out with unprecedented clarity, as if he had deeply engraved them at the bottom of his heart. Although the words that Luo Fan used were simple, there was a deeper mystery in his tone, and the intensity of his voice. With the current level of Hong Jun and the others, if it wasn't for the clear light that Luo Fan's body emitted, it would be impossible for them to completely remember all of this. As a result, they wouldn't be able to further comprehend the deeper mysteries contained in these words after their own cultivation realm had increased. Precisely because of this, Luo Fan had to use his own will to create an environment that could not only isolate the movement inside and outside, but also allow them to remember more mysteries in his words in the process. This time, the preaching did not take long. In just a short 3 days, Luo Fan had already integrated everything that he wanted to say into his words and engraved them in the hearts of Hong Jun and the others. Just as he stopped preaching, there was a sudden crackling sound coming from Hong Jun's body. As the sound rang out, an endless amount of power slowly dispersed from his body, gradually merging with the surrounding void. It was gradually devoured by the void. With this change, Hong Jun's aura began to weaken rapidly. From a distance of a piece of paper away from becoming a sage to be, he became an ordinary, innate Grand Luo in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, he fell back to the primordial pure yang level, and in the blink of an eye, he became an earth immortal, and so on and so forth. In just a few short breaths, he had already brazenly turned from a peak, innate Grand Luo expert to an ordinary mortal without any cultivation base. It was very obvious that after he heard what Luo Fan had said, he resolutely gave up all his past achievements in cultivation and prepared to recultivate. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed and focused his will. The clear light gathered around Hong Jun and directly protected his body. This allowed him to exist safely in the void at the center of the world group and not be harmed at all. At this moment, Luo Fu and the others finally realized what had happened. All of a sudden, their expressions changed. There was admiration, disbelief, and some even had an inexplicable realization. They seemed to have figured out why Hong Jun was so much stronger than them despite having the same cultivation base. "Thank you, Master." Hong Jun kowtowed at Luo Fan. At this moment, his expression was calm and indifferent. Although he no longer had any cultivation base, and his cultivation base had completely disappeared, there was an indescribable light of enlightenment in his eyes. It seemed like he was more clear-headed than before, and his spiritual state was higher. Don't stand on ceremony. Now that you have no cultivation base, it's not safe for you to go anywhere else. Why don't you recultivate here? Luo Fan said calmly. Yes. Hong Jun responded and bowed again. He got up and sat down with his legs crossed. He began to gather energy bit by bit and began to push it in his body. Compared to normal recultivation, Hong Jun's speed of recultivation this time was much slower. It was even slower than when he obtained his cultivation base from nothing. It was as if he spent hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times more time and energy to comprehend every bit of improvement and improvement. Luo Fan knew at a glance that he was sorting out his understanding of the world and everything in the world bit by bit during this process. He wanted to sort out his worldview bit by bit during the process of cultivation. This method, compared to what he did in the past, when he had a powerful cultivation base, he went into seclusion to sort out his mind and memories and to organize and consolidate his worldview. Although his cultivation base was not strong enough, so the speed was extremely slow, but it was better in terms of a solid foundation. Every piece of the worldview that he sorted out had an extremely deep integration with him. This integration would weaken the obstacles that prevented him from perfectly integrating his worldview with himself in the future. From a certain point of view, this was more beneficial than Luo Fan's choice of going into closed-door cultivation in the Khanate Grand Luo realm for millions of years to sort out his worldview, of course. There is a crucial difficulty in making this choice to seek fortune and avoid disaster. It required a powerful force to protect him from the danger of losing his cultivation base. "You guys go," said Luo Fan with a sigh in his heart when he saw Luo Fu and the others wavering. Luo Fu and the others were slightly relieved, but soon they felt inexplicably ashamed. "Don't mind it. This is your own cultivation. You don't have to compare yourself with others. Your eldest senior brother's choice is the best choice for him, but it might not be the same for you." Luo Fan smiled and comforted them. Hearing this, Luo Fu and the others recovered. They bowed to Luo Fan one by one before gradually dispersing and leaving the world cluster. At this moment, their hearts were filled with boundless gratitude towards Luo Fan. They were no longer muddle-headed creatures like before. Now that they had been tempered for a long period of time, their minds and temperaments had reached an extremely profound level. How could they not know how precious the things that Luo Fan had just told them were? How could they not understand how rare it was for Luo Fan to share these things with them, and how much care he had shown them? They believed that if they knew everything Luo Fan knew, they would not hand over the knowledge to their disciples so easily. Even if their sons were among them, it would not be any different. This was not because they were selfish, but because it was human nature. Otherwise, why would those rich people only distribute their property to their children after they die? Why did the ancient emperors leave posthumous edicts to pass the throne to their children before they died? However, this time, Luo Fan told them the true way to become a true sage without reservation. This was the first time they saw the hope of transcendence since they were born. They saw the possibility of breaking away from the shackles of heaven and earth. How could they not be grateful for this kindness? In fact, it was because of this that they were so hesitant when facing Hongjuan's choice, because they did not know if Hongjuan's action was what Luo Fan expected. Let's not separate for now. We need a long period of stability for our next cultivation. Let's put other things aside first. After leaving the world cluster, Luo Fu said to Guangpu and Luo Chunyang. When Guangpu and the rest heard this, they did not hesitate. They just nodded and agreed to this suggestion.